Order, order. Before I call the honourable member for South Norfolk to move the motion, I would like to inform members that the Parliamentary Digital Communications team will be conducting secondary filming during today's debate for their series on procedural explainers. I should say that 49 colleagues are put in to speak in this debate, and therefore, if everybody is to get in, I have to impose from the very beginning a 3-minute limit on everybody taking part in this debate after the opener of the debate and apart from the wind-ups. And I should say that every time you intervene, of course, you are ensuring that one of your colleagues will not get in at the end. And I say to the opener that if he takes too many interventions and his speech goes too long, he's preventing other people taking part. So as long as you all bear that in mind, short speeches, no more than 3 minutes. Order, order. Ben Goldsborough to move the motion.
Thank you very much. I beg to move that this House is considered e-petition 700138 relating to inheritance tax relief for working farms. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Sir Edward. To date, the petition in question has received just shy of 150,000 signatures, a mark of strength, the feeling that exists about this proposed policy change. The petitioners argue that, and I quote, changing inheritance tax relief for agricultural land will devastate farms nationwide, forcing families to sell land and assets just to stay on their property. I want to put on record my thanks for the diligent staff of the Petitions Committee, who have secured for me, as a representative of the petitioners, meetings with the NFU, the CLA, the Tax Policy Associates, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Rural Accountancy Group. As a Member of Parliament for the rural constituency in South Norfolk, which is formed of a patchwork quilt of farms, I am honoured to lead this debate, and in doing so to give a voice to the farmers in my constituency who have contacted me to share their thoughts about the planned changes to inheritance tax on agricultural businesses. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. In 2012, there was a proposal, which my right honourable friend and I certainly opposed by the then Chancellor, to impose VAT on static caravans. It was clearly wrong when you looked into it. Will the honourable gentleman do the right thing, represent his rural constituents and recognise that this ruinous policy will not only destroy family farms across the country, it'll put up food prices and worsen our national energy security? Do the right thing, challenge your own Chancellor and take some of your colleagues with you.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention at 1 minute 26. I'll try and get through my speech so you can hear what I'm about to say. As I say, to give a voice to the farmers in my constituency who have contacted me to share their thoughts about the planned changes to inheritance tax on agricultural businesses. It is their views, not mine, that I'll be focusing on today. There are not many petitions that have been submitted to the committee which can demonstrate not just a willingness for online activism, but also real-world engagement with Parliament. Campaigns by the NFU, the CLA and the CPRE have been effective in drawing attention to petitioners' concerns, as has the Stop the Family Farm Tax campaign, which has placed banners across many constituencies, including mine. No matter your opinion on the proposed policy changes, this issue has created public engagement with politics from the countryside, which hasn't been seen in over 20 years. That is why today's debate is both needed and important, to demonstrate to farmers that by peacefully engaging with Parliament, their voices can be heard. They have been effective in successfully shedding light on the daily challenges facing this fundamental sector, and I thank them for this and would encourage them to continue to advocate positively for rural Britain. In my speech today, I want to touch upon 3 key areas that I've discussed with the NFU, the CLA and others. Firstly, the feeling of many farmers towards the planned policy changes. Secondly, the statistics that underpin the debate. And thirdly, proposals put forward by petitioners, stakeholders and experts, which I believe are important for the Minister to hear and respond to, based on the Government's current thinking. I'll aim to cover these topics on behalf of petitioners without being sensationalist. After all, a lot of emotion and politics has been attached to this debate so far, and understandably so. Nonetheless, this is arguably at times to obscure the rational arguments which many farmers, MPs and organisations have been making, some of which accept that agricultural property relief is likely to change, but advocate for a more graduated approaches. Today is a day for calm, thoughtful debate on behalf of the petitioners, and I welcome all members' contributions in this spirit. I suggest that the end game, a more acceptable policy for farmers, won't be achieved through bashing DEFRA, the Treasury, the Minister here today, or by simply repeating the well-worn arguments that we've heard over the past few months. Let this debate be a reflection of what this House does best, which is to consider a complex problem from all sides and seek to offer potential solutions to the government. Give way.
If we take it that the government is trying to address the large tax avoiders, the Dysons and people with billionaires who are investing to avoid this, and you want to protect real farmers, it's perfectly possible for the HMRC to do so. Farmers are not on PAYE. They all make submissions every year on the amount of time and work and effort and money they make from farming. Wouldn't it be possible to give an unlimited exemption to people who are real farmers based on their HMRC submissions?
Thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. There'll be something I'll be covering on in my speech later on. Since being elected as the MP for South Norfolk, I've made a conscious choice to sit around as many farmhouse tables as humanly possible. It has been clear to me that South Norfolk needed politics to be done differently. And instead of being on broadcast mode, I've done all I can to listen, engage and try and deliver for all constituents in my little slice of Norfolk. I know many of my colleagues on the government benches have done exactly the same. Not all conversations have been smooth, but as I have said to my recent meeting of the NFU, Norwich and Loddon branch, I will never shirk away from my responsibility to be their voice in Parliament and raising their views with ministers. Today I've had the opportunity to do this as a member of the Petitions Committee, and I welcome the opportunity to lay out the arguments I've heard over the past few weeks in preparation for today.
I'm very grateful for the honourable member giving away, and listening is really important. And the things that I've heard from my farmers is they're either caught up between, is this a mistake or is this done on purpose? Did the government mistakenly realise it was going to bring all these family farmers into this inheritance tax and agricultural change? Or, worse still, was it planned all along and is a way of getting the land towards housing and some of the net zero targets? Either could be true. Does he have a preference over which one it is? Because I think farmers want to know, was it a mistake and should it be rectified? Or is this an ideal policy driven by the government?
Thank the honourable member. As I say, what I'm about to do now is actually give you testimonies of my farmers in South Norfolk. I think all too often, as politicians, we're very keen to share the own limelight of ourselves instead of listening to those on the ground that actually want to put forward their opinions. And that's what I'm about to do now. One of my local farmers, Will, asked me to share his words in today's debate. He said, and I quote, "The government's decision to make major changes to APR and BPR will spell the end for many family farms. Before this announcement, agriculture was already going through a difficult period, and for many farmers, the news has left them without hope." Another farmer, Robert, wished for me to say, "We are trapped with no way to mitigate against the effects of this cruel tax. Farming is who we are, it's in our blood, it's all we want to do." And another, Tim, requested me to share that I've spent my entire working life trying to build this farm up and have added 200 acres in my time. I see myself as a custodian of land for which I look like the back of my hand, and I feel responsible for it. To have to sell it would be devastating and would go against all that I've worked for. Will, Robert and Tim all fear significant consequences of the proposed APR changes on smaller family farmers, and I believe that their views are shared by many farmers who have historically operated under a 100% agricultural property relief system. There is no getting away from their genuine concerns, and I know that my honourable friend the Minister will address these feelings in a sensitive manner that they require in his response. There can be no doubt that the arguments that land values are artificially high due to APR have credence. It is also undeniably true that we are seeing non-farmers buying land for tax efficiency reasons. Neither of these trends are positive. But to be clear, this doesn't mean that farmers are wrong when they raise concerns about paying a large one-off inheritance tax bill with anything other than the land they need to keep their heads above water, even if the bill is spread over 10 years. This as a proposed policy change has, therefore, arguably pointed to a fundamental issue for agriculture, which is the annual profitability of British farms. There is significant work for this government to do to ensure that farms up and down the UK become more profitable during this Parliament, and I know the Minister is working hard to do this.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for bringing this petition, which some Monmouthshire farmers have signed. But do you agree with our Labour government policy, which is to protect farmers in trade deals, unlike the opposition, who unfortunately signed trade deals which flooded our high streets and our towns with foreign imports? And that would really help with the profitability of farms.
I thank the honourable friend for that intervention. I think this is one of the things as well that this debate has created is a vacuum for us to actually talk about the other issues as well affecting farms. The honourable gentleman opposite me, we had an amazing debate on biosecurity in the UK where there was many cross-party consensus on the issues we need to address there. There's also the issues on SFI and BPS payments and the future of elms. There is so much we need to be doing, and trade deals that are going forward are one of those such areas. I thank my friend for that. Chair, you've just heard me touch upon some of the concerns of our farmers, but facts and figures are also important. So I'll move on to these. I apologise in advance, and the next bit of my speech may sound a little bit dry. The most recent data shows that the top 7% of inheritance tax relief claims accounts for 40% of the total cost of agricultural property relief. That is a value of £219 million. The top 20%, just 37 claims, account for 22% relief, worth £119 million. This is factual data, and in this context, the government's ambition for implementing this policy is sound. To end the system by which the very wealthiest in this country can avoid huge sums of inheritance tax by buying up land. But the petitioners argue that the proposed policy changes will not achieve this because it's not just the wealthiest landowners who will be impacted. The CLA estimates that with a cap on the full relief of 1 million, as many as 70,000 farms could be impacted. The NFU estimates that 75% of commercial family farms will exceed the 1 million cap, which, of course, can be as high as 3 million, but only under certain conditions. Petitioners and local farmers regularly remind me that not every farmer is married or lives in a farmhouse of their own name. In contrast, the Treasury predicts that only around 500 estates will be affected each year, based on historic claims. The IFS and the CLA both independently acknowledged in discussions with me that it's very hard to project revenue or impact because of behavioural changes are extremely hard to account for. What is clear, however, is that behavioural changes required by farmers will be enormous. I just want to continue for a little while. There is therefore a deep uncertainty among farmers about what these changes will mean for them. Uncertainty is bad for business, it's also bad for farmers' mental health. I would therefore encourage the government to offer as much proactive engagement and clarity to farmers as possible, including in their response today. Another primary reason farmers are so concerned is that, in short, they already face a challenge keeping their business profitable. The CLA modelled a typical 350-acre arable farm. They told me that even spreading that cost over 10 years, the farmer would be paying 100% of their annual profits for each of those 10 years to cover the proposed inheritance tax bill. That's a decade without profit. It should be acknowledged that all individuals across the UK are subject to rules which encourage gifting in advance of death. Farmers are likely to enter this world. It is true that farmers have held on to assets for longer than the average person because of APR, and this habit is unlikely to continue. I now want to move on to the part of my speech. I just want to move on to the next part. I've taken a lot of intervention. I'm sorry, the honourable gentleman. I now want to move on to the part of this speech which is a touch upon solutions. The petition is very clear that it seeks for the policy to be scrapped. I will leave it for the Minister to provide his response to the official position. Suffice to say that I think everyone in this room can agree that land banking for inheritance tax purposes is wrong, and land values are prohibitively expensive for many farms to expand, or, even more so, for new farmers to enter the industry. These are things that many farmers would like to see over the coming years. If the policy isn't scrapped altogether, then farmers have told me that alternatives could be considered to give the sector more stability at the same time as helping the government achieve its ambition for a thriving rural economy. One such alternative is a shortened taper rate for older farmers. Under this proposal, a farmer aged, for example, 70 would be given 2 to 3 years to hand over their property, with a 33% or a 50% taper rate after 1 year. I know farmers in my constituency would welcome the Minister's thoughts on this proposal, as it was raised with me at a recent meeting between myself and the NFU Eastern team. There are, of course, various ways of tweaking such approach by age or taper time, but according to farmers, movement on this front would give those who have worked the longest under the existing APR rules the ability to more quickly arrange their affairs.
with respect to the Honourable Gentleman, I'm just confused by his argument, because he's talking about the scope, which is the crux of this issue. What is the scope of this tax? Now, he voted in favour of not changing it. He was quoted in the Eastern Daily Press as saying that it would not hit proper farming families. Is that his position, that this tax doesn't hit, quotes, proper farming families, or should the scope of the tax be changed? Because that is the crux of the issue. And with respect to the argument he's set out, I don't know what his position is, other than he voted not to change it.
Try and bring his remarks soon to a close. So let others in, please. Thank you.
Just a quick reply to that. At the start of my speech, I said the problem has been this has been turned into a political football and undermining the ability for us to actually, in clear-minded ways, speak about options and opportunities. And it's really sad that the fact that I can see a shadow minister on the opposite side, who I know worked very hard on this, and that I've been able to work with him cross-party, but at the same time, the Shadow Secretary of State does not want to work in a manner that could get the best outcome for our farmers, and that's very sad. Anyway,
I thought, perhaps wrongly, because of my inexperience, that somebody standing here to represent petitioners had to make the argument for and believe in what the petitioners are asking for. We have had absolutely the opposite today. Those petitioners had no service from this committee up until this point.
Well, that's not true. It's a matter of debate, but I'm sure there's plenty of people here which will give the arguments for the petitioners, so I wouldn't worry over much about it. Ben Goldsborough to wind up, please.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward. As I say, there is one other option that I think is important for us to consider before I wind up fully, and that is the words of Mr Needle, who has recently said that a clawback system would be something that the government should consider as well, by potentially raising the threshold and also looking at a repayment. In conclusion, Sir Edward, I just want to say that my job today has been to represent the views of 150,000 people who signed this petition, and by pulling across the various options that people would like to see, I believe that I have done that. I would like to thank the honourable friends around this room on all political parties for showing the engagement and interest in this issue. It is important for all of us that we are standing up for our communities, and I thank everyone for doing that.
Well said.
And I would just like to say as well to the Minister, I thank him for listening to my contribution. I hope that he takes it in the spirit of friendship that it was meant, with the options on the table that I hope that those outside would like to hear a response from the government as to what action will be taken. Thank you.
I remind members that if they want to speak, they must bob. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 700-138 relating to inheritance tax relief for working farmers, and I call John Lamont.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to serve with you in the chair. Today I want to highlight the short-sighted, the reckless and misguided Labour policy to increase tax on farmers. Let's start by paying tribute to the petitioner for raising this important issue, and to the hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers outside this place showing how much they hate this policy. This is an issue that has dismayed and appalled my constituents in the Scottish Borders. They are bitterly disappointed because this decision by Sir Keir Starmer will mean the sad, even tragic end of many family farms. Many farmers will no longer be able to pass on their property, which their ancestors might have worked for decades or longer, to the next generation. That is not right. No. It's not why they've worked so hard to look after the countryside, why they've got up early and worked late all their days. What makes it worse is they feel betrayed by a Labour government that promised this wouldn't happen. Labour made it abundantly clear that they would not increase taxes on farmers. But just like the winter fuel payment to pensioners and national insurance rises on businesses, Labour didn't tell the truth. They broke their promises, and the consequence of Labour not keeping their words will be profound to the Borders, Scotland and the United Kingdom. It's not only farmers in my constituency that this impacts. It's not only workers in the rural economy. It's not only businesses in the food and drink industry. If this policy continues, it will be everyone and in one or other way. Labour's decision will force the break-up of many family farms, which will be tragic for many of those families. But it will also mean higher prices in shops and at supermarkets for the rest of us. It will put our food security at risk. and it will harm the environment as we are forced to rely on costly imports that are not as high quality and flown in from much further away. Now, how does any of this make sense? I'll give way to my honourable friends.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friends. Does he share my concerns that the government showing their inability to crack a good deal when they go into negotiations may well give in to any potential trade with America and allow cheaper products to undermine our beef and chicken farms?
My honourable friend makes a very important point. If we are no longer self-sufficient in terms of food production, we will become much more dependent on overseas, less good quality imports. So Labour have made a grave error that will cost our farmers and our country dearly. That's why so many people in the borders and across the whole of the United Kingdom are concerned by this decision. It will have negative consequences that last generations that may not be repairable. Because unlike any other businesses, farms can't come back once they close. They are often gone for good. But Labour simply aren't listening. They even admitted as much to me lately. I recently submitted a question asking the Secretary of State for DEFRA how much correspondence his department has received from individuals making representation on changes to APR and BPR for inheritance tax since October. Sir Edward, the only response I got was, they don't know. They don't have this information. This shows a stunning lack of disrespect for farmers and food producers. Simply, the Labour government simply don't care. Labour need to rethink their family farm tax policy. They said change often enough in the run-up to the general election. Well, that's exactly what needs to happen now. This deeply damaging policy needs to change. It needs to be scrapped or family farms will be lost. Supermarket prices will go up, food security will be at risk, and our environment will suffer. The Scottish and British people have spoken on this policy. Now Labour need to listen.
Sean Woodcock.
Thank you, Chair. I want to keep my comments brief, but every week when I'm out in the constituency, I take time to visit a farm. This issue always comes up. It is concerning many within my constituency. They want to be very clear that it's not like everything was ticking along nicely and then suddenly this hit. They were sold down the river by the party opposite with the trade deals involving Australia and New Zealand, but this has caused a great deal of consternation. I want to quote a chap who I visited last month when he said that, I don't want to tell a tale of woe, I'm doing okay. There are good farmers and there are bad farmers, which affects profitability, but I am concerned that this policy is going to rob me of my inheritance that my several generations of my family have worked incredibly hard to build up. This level of concern, justified or not, I believe merits the government listening, and I hope that they will do so. Thank you.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Sir. The government has said they're listening. I also hope they hear the tractors and the farmers from across this country who are outside this building today, showing their disgust at this proposal that has been brought forward. Mr. Edward, I want to take this opportunity. There are many contributors. I want to bring the Northern Ireland specific angle to this debate. 150,000 petitioners have signed this petition today. Sir Edward, I had the pleasure of presenting the petition on behalf of the Ulster Farmers Union, where 15,000 people from Northern Ireland signed a similar petition in regards to the opposition of what the government wants to bring forward and decimate the Northern Ireland family farm and the Northern Ireland family farming industry, because this will hit us disproportionately to the rest of the United Kingdom in regards to our family structure, but also our family size, our farm size. Sir Edward, recently, and this is where the Treasury's figures don't match up with that of the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland, nor the Northern Ireland Rural Valuers Association. Recently we had bare agricultural land sell for £28,000 per acre. And I want to clarify that. That's per acre, because I know there was those in the Treasury who, when this was first instigated, actually got acres and hectares mixed up. Sir Edward, when you put that price of land on bare family farms in Northern Ireland, it starts to put the bare minimum small family farm in the scope of what will be not only a financial grab, but it will see the end and the decimation of what has been a generation of farms to build up. Our own department figures are saying now that 80% of Northern Ireland's total farmland will fall within this scope. 90% of our dairy industry, 80% of our total farmland, 70% of our beef and sheep farming as well. So the proposal that this tax grab, this wrecking financial grab will have on Northern Ireland farmers, not on farmers across the United Kingdom, I don't think this government has fully listened to what is coming from our Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland, our Department of Agriculture here, and it is simply, I think as a member said earlier, that it's a treasury grab at a balance to look at a spreadsheet rather than a true understanding as to the impact that this will have on families and generations across our country. So I asked the government, I asked the Minister to engage and make sure that Treasury actually engages with the farm unions across this nation, because I don't think they've fully grasped the impact that this is going to have.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. There's no doubt that farmers have suffered hugely over the past 14 years, with the damaging impact of botched Tory trade deals and trade barriers doing a huge amount to undermine their hard work. I know that there's so much the government can do and is doing to support farmers. I welcome the £5 billion pledge to support them over 2 years to support farming, the biggest ever sustainable food production investment that we've seen, and that will make a huge difference. But I must be honest, some farmers in my constituency have raised concerns with me about the tax changes announced in the budget, including the 40 or so farmers that I met this morning in my constituency. That's why I felt it was important to speak in this debate today, to give them a voice and convey their concerns directly to the Minister. I should start by saying that I support government efforts to tackle the actions of some of the wealthiest people in our society buying up farmland to avoid inheritance tax. These selfish individuals are not only starving our public services of much-needed funds, but they're undermining farming by inflating the price of farmland and preventing young farmers from entering the sector. Tackling this problem is something fundamental that many farmers in my constituency support. If the Minister will allow me, I will take a moment to list some of the concerns raised by farmers in North Warwickshire and Bedworth, starting with Robert from Overhouse Farm in Dordon. He asked whether the IHT threshold could be raised beyond 1 million. Joe and Martin Brandreth, farmers from Philongley and Bedworth in my constituency, have asked what steps the Treasury has taken to forecast future farmland valuations for how much this tax will raise, to ensure the policy has been calculated on the basis of valuations of properties at the point of tax and not on historic values. Helen Fisher from Grendon has expressed her concerns that changes to inheritance tax will reduce the incentive for farms to invest in improving their productivity. Could the Minister confirm what action has been taken to ensure farmers are incentivised to make their farms more productive? Chris Corbett from Atherstone has raised concerns about the impact erratic weather is having on the productivity of his farm, with a 30% drop in harvests this year. Can the Minister set out what the government's doing to support farmers to adapt to the challenge of climate change and improve productivity? Ralph Arnold from Seckington near Tamworth has asked whether the government could consider rethinking nitrogen fertiliser tax or exempting double cab pickups from vehicle taxation when they are in use as essential farm vehicles. And finally, Adam Beattie is a tenant farmer who's concerned about the impact on him should his landlord try and sell to cover an inheritance tax liability. There are a number of other points I wanted to make, but time is short. Farming is fundamental to the fabric of our nation and is at the heart of my constituency.
Thank you for calling me. This is a flagrant reversal of promises made. The Prime Minister appeared before the National Farmers Union Conference and he shed crocodile tears. He said to the hundreds of farmers assembled and the widely listening electorate from the rural areas that he knew what it meant to lose a family farm. And his voice trembled with that emotional resonance as he conveyed to those constituents in my constituency and across England and all the regions of this great country that he would never impose upon them the tax that he has imposed upon them now. It was a cynical breach of a promise made by a man seeking the highest office in this land.
Hear, hear.
And upon those promises, Sir Edward, thousands of people relied. The elderly widower, whose deceased spouse cannot transfer her allowance. The widows, the elderly farmers, who may now fear that unless they survive 7 years, their family farm, often the work of a century of their ancestors, of herds cultivated and nurtured over decades, will be lost because they must sell off great portions of their farms. And these farms are farmed not necessarily for the profit they make, because the profit is exiguous, but rather for the love of the life they lead and for the support of the fabric of the rural communities we who represent them cherish and adore. And it is that blow, I say to the Minister, aimed with unerring accuracy at the very heart of rural life, that is the reason for the outrage you hear not only upon these benches today, but listen to the horns that are blowing outside. That is the voice of real democracy. That is the voice of the people crying out to those of us here to change direction upon this harmful and damaging decision. And so I say, Sir Edward, I appeal to the Minister, for whom I feel sorry. He has been sent out like a night watchman to face the fast bowling in the twilight of the evening on the Test match's last day, and it is Michael Holding coming into bowl. I don't envy his task. Go back to his seniors. Tell them to change their direction. The time has come for the ministry and the ministers to accept they are wrong. Their figures are wrong. Change the policy.
Alistair Carmichael.
Chair of the Select Committee, I've not been short of opportunities to speak about this issue in recent months, so I shall keep my remarks today very short in the hope that others might have the opportunity to place their constituents' concerns on record. I should have also declared at the start that I am myself a farmer and landowner, and that's referred to in my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. The honourable gentleman introducing the debate said quite rightly that what was necessary now was meaningful engagement with government, and he's absolutely right in that regard. And can I say to the Minister who replying today, that engagement has to come from the Chancellor of the Exchequer herself. For her not to have met yet with representatives of the farming unions from across the 4 nations of this country is unacceptable, and that has to change soon. Farmers are not, as the Secretary of State said to the Select Committee on the 19th of November, wrong in their understanding of this. What is wrong is the numbers in which the government have based the policy that they have brought forward. It will affect many, many more farmers and estates than is currently believed or admitted by Treasury. As Jeremy Warner said when he was giving evidence to the Select Committee, this is a policy that penalises those that the government wants to protect while protecting those that they say they want to penalise. There is a need now for this whole policy to be paused and reconsidered. It needs to be done because there was no proper consideration given in the first instance to the full range of unintended consequences. And in that regard, I have one question I would like to hear the Minister answer when he comes to reply to the debate. Before this policy announcement was made, what consideration was given in Treasury to the very particular position of tenants in Scotland who hold their tenancy under the 1991 Act? Essentially, the situation there is that a 1991 tenancy gives rise to an asset that is a chargeable asset for taxation purposes, which survives death. But because they are tenants, they do not have an asset that they can then sell on in order to pay their tax bill. That seems to me to be a point of fundamental inequity. And if the Minister did not consider that before they brought the proposals in the budget, then what else was it that was given insufficient consideration? There is a need to reform inheritance tax. There are things that you can do good things for agriculture that you could do with proper consideration. But in order to do that, the policy must first of all be paused, and the proper engagement that we've spoken of needs to happen.
Jamie Stone. Sorry, is Jamie Stone?
Thank you very much, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I just say, by way of housekeeping, as the chair of the Petitions Committee, how delighted I am to see such a fantastic attendance here today. I want to say just two very simple things. A week ago yesterday, I attended the farmers' rally. I was the only politician there. I attended the farmers' rally in John O'Groats, at the other end of the United Kingdom. And I can tell you this, it was a cold, blowy day, and the farmers and their tractors were out in force. And I spoke to so many of them, and the concern was, even that far away from here, was exactly the same as we're hearing expressed today. The fear of losing the farm. And that takes me to my second and simple point, which is this. I was brought up on a farm, Sir Edward, a dairy farm. It was bought by my great-great-grandfather, Donald Fraser. And it was in the family from the early to middle 19th century, a long, long time. But through financial circumstances, my father had to sell almost all of it off. Today, my brother and I own the princely sum of 2 fields. And yet, here's the point. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't look towards the fields we used to own on the shores of the Donach Firth and wish that we still owned them. It's in my blood. It's not like selling stocks and shares. It's not like selling a holiday home in Spain. It's in the blood. It's in the family. And here's the point. Unless I was to win the lottery, I would never be able to buy those fields back again. And I'm not likely to win the lottery, and even then, land goes up in value. So my point is this. It's emotional. The attachment is there, and that makes it so very different to other forms of things you might own. And finally, the point's already been made. Once the farm has gone, it's gone forever. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, it's David Smith, isn't it? David Smith.
Thank you, Sir Edward.
Oh, she's not standing, is she?
I've been having dozens and dozens of conversations with farmers across my constituency in North Northumberland, and it's become clear to me that they welcome the principle of this policy, which is to stop the super wealthy from land banking agricultural land in order to minimise their tax liability. And consequently, not one of those farmers has told me that they have a problem with the aim of the policy of stopping the wealthy avoiding tax. However, in the same conversations, many of the same farmers are also telling me that they're concerned that their businesses could be adversely affected. And I wonder if the relief element of the policy could be recalibrated. I know that the government's aim is to support our farmers and our food security, but we're doing this in a context where Tory inaction over 14 years has led them with great challenges, whether it's climate change, a muddled and chaotic Brexit, deals that we've heard about on lamb and beef that our farmers are concerned about. We're not in a vacuum here, Mr Chairman. In the end, I'm the first Labour MP in history for the vast majority of my constituency, and it's not because the population were happy with what the Conservatives delivered for the countryside and farmers. So I asked the government whether it could consider, if the balance is quite right. I've spoken to farmers in my constituency where their farms are worth 5 million, 8 million and 20 million, and everything in between. And sometimes with their cash flow, it means that they may have an inheritance bill of 2 Absolutely.
Thank you for giving way. And does the honourable member agree with me and a farmer that I visited in my constituency yesterday, Emma, who's a dairy farmer, who has a real issue with the fact that she still has a mortgage on her farm? So how would the inheritance tax work? She can't pass on her farm now because she still has a mortgage. So how might that work?
I thank the Honourable Lady for the intervention. There are a great many challenges, as I've said, that our farmers are facing, including being very over-leveraged in debt, and that's something that I think we should consider. I spoke to one farmer whose land is valued at £16 million, but their new inheritance tax liability would be about £2.8 million. but they make just £96,000 profit per year. So there are several examples of farmers who face enormous bills but with low profits. Absolutely.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. And my farmers in my Shrewsbury constituency have told me that for many years now they've struggled to make a profit. Indeed, they say the only game in town is to go big or go bust. In other words, 12,000 small farmers have gone under because over the last decade it's not been a profitable business. And they say to me that they're ready to make some of these behavioural changes, to pass the asset down to the next generation so it can be profitable and sustainable and environmentally friendly, because that next generation have just come out of agricultural college and learned all these new techniques. But they do tell me that they wish to pass on the information that our oldest farmers will not be able to make that behaviour change quick enough. And would the Minister consider some temporary transition extension to the taper, perhaps at year 2, just to help them make the changes that they are willing to make this policy work? Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention and agree these are some of the challenges that our farmers are facing. And as these examples show, the value of the land is often not bearing a relation to the limited cash flow and profit that is being made. However, what is reassuring, Mr Chair, is that a few tweaks to the policy would remove most of this pressure on family farms while maintaining the pressure on land bankers, which is the focus. There's hardly a single North Northumberland farm that will enjoy 100% relief, even with the nil rate ban, so raising the threshold would provide instant peace of mind to family farmers. And finally, I suspect the Government could use RPA and DEFRA data to implement an active farmer test and judge if the land is being put to public use and is therefore eligible for relief. This would differentiate between intergenerational farmers and those simply buying farmland in order to reduce their tax liability. If a clawback mechanism is added and the land is then sold, say after 10 years after gifting, then the Government can reserve the right to claw the relief back for the public purse. Many of these measures have been in place in Ireland since 2015. I know the Minister is also hearing what I am from farmers across the country, and so I urge him and the colleagues to work together to consider whether this policy can be recalibrated to achieve both of the Government's aims of supporting our nation's family farms whilst closing the loopholes that have distorted our land values for too long.
Damien Hines.
Thank you very much, sir. The Government talks a lot about growth, and we debate often here in the economic growth. When we talk about farming, we talk rather about food production and sufficiency and security. We talk about land stewardship. We talk about fairness. We talk about rural communities and the countryside way of life. All those things are true and relevant, but this is also a debate about economic growth. Because economic growth requires productivity gains. Productivity gains require investment, and this policy is clearly going to hit badly investment in the vital rural sector. That is intuitively obvious, because there's a new liability that these agricultural businesses have to plan for. But it also chimes entirely with what I hear in and around Hampshire from agricultural suppliers, from machinery dealers and so on, with redundancies, with depot closures, with projects being cancelled. And my question to the Minister is, what monitoring is the Government doing of actual investment in the agricultural sector and the harm that that may do to productivity? Now, it's often said, and it's been said again today, that farming is not like a normal business. My East Hampshire farmers are very quick to remind us it is a business and you have to be able to make a living. But it is abnormal in one key sense. Economists talk about normal profit and supernormal profit. There's no such thing as subnormal profit, because if you're not making enough to make the thing economic, the idea is you wouldn't be in the business. But many of these are. These are farmers who accept a sub-economic return on capital employed. And they do that because, yes, it is a business, but it's more than a business. It's more than a job. It's more than just an investment. And ministers should not expect the same approach to be taken if the family farms are broken up and replaced by something else. Now, repeatedly, the Government have said, oh, don't worry, because the effect of this will be reduced because couples can pass on assets between them. But we know, because of the written question tabled by my right honourable friend, that actually only half of farmers are in couples. Almost half are individuals, and this is going to affect far more farms than I think the Treasury, to be fair to them, the officials even realised to begin with, and certainly the numbers that we have discussed in this House. I say to the Minister, there are reasons why this relief was brought in the first place. It was not a loophole, it was not an accident. It was brought in to achieve a purpose. And there are reasons too why it was retained all these years. Now, Sir Edward, it is not unheard of for a government to discover that when it brings in a tax, its effect in practice is not quite as they expected when they did the spreadsheet and when the Minister signed off the sub. It is not too late for this Minister, for this government, to change their minds, to make significant changes. There's no shame in it, and I urge him to do so.
Yeah. Sam Rushworth. Have we got him? Yeah. Hello.
For the farmers in my constituency in Bishop Auckland, which is a Labour farming community. And the farmers in my area are worried. And they're people who put their trust in us at the general election. And why did they do so? Well, they did so because they'd been so badly let down for 14 years before. They did so because they knew that there was more that could have been done by the previous government on things like trade deals, supply chains, flood defences and on crime. So let me tell you what farmers in my constituency are telling me about this issue. They say, as has been said already, that they have no problem with the principle that we should be closing tax loopholes. They want to stop billionaires, to quote the Telegraph, from hoovering up agricultural land, which they know is pushing up land prices. And they even support the principle, Minister, of paying tax and raising revenue for a Treasury, because they know that Treasury revenue is necessary to improve the NHS and to improve schools in their communities, as well as a strong agricultural budget. But they are asking, and they're not asking, by the way, for a full U-turn, but they are asking for some meaningful tweaks that will help the policy to better target the goals that it intends to achieve.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank you, honourable friend. We've heard quite a few suggestions already today for ways that this policy could be tweaked, could be amended. Would he join me in urging the Minister to get Treasury officials to at least model some of these changes to help advance this debate in the coming months?
Thank you. I welcome that intervention. And there are two areas in particular that I think farmers in my constituency would like some answers. And one of them is around thresholds. You see, because the policy still keeps 50% agricultural property relief, it doesn't actually close a tax loophole at all for the very wealthiest. And they'd like to see the modelling from the Treasury that says that it would. Meanwhile, because the threshold is quite low, it does mean, sadly, that some of the family farms in my constituency will really struggle to pay that inheritance tax bill. So they would like to see what modelling has been done around the thresholds, because they understand that, and again, they're not asking for you to, they understand that this should be neutral to the Treasury, but they would be interested to know if we could lift the threshold but go to 40% tax at another threshold, whether that wouldn't both better protect the small family farms while at the same time doing a better job at closing the tax loophole. And on another point where they would welcome some consideration is this proposal of a clawback. Because, you see, if you inherit a £5 million farm, you're not a millionaire. You're the custodian of agricultural land with the responsibility to farm it to produce food for the nation. If you sell a £5 million farm, you become a millionaire. But you're not simply by inheriting one. So they would also be interested to look at that. And I think it would be helpful for the farmers in my constituency to understand the modelling the Treasuries have done. And finally, just to say, there is amongst that community, a Labour farming community, goodwill for this government on many of the things that we are trying to achieve. And that goodwill can be retained. And I think there would be no shame in looking at this again.
That's a very thoughtful contribution, and he's clearly looking at ways in which this can be amended in order to make it more palatable to the farming community. That may be the reality that we're looking at, rather than getting rid of it altogether. Therefore, would he not also agree that we should be looking at changing the transitional arrangements in order that succession planning could be properly undertaken, because that clearly can't, or indeed leaseback arrangements to enable viable farms to continue?
Well, I think there's a variety of things that could be looked at, and I've met with the NFU this morning, and we discussed various points. But I feel that these are all things that should be considered. And I just want to close by reiterating that I believe that the community that I represent still has goodwill towards this government and the intentions of this government. But I do think that there are aspects of the policy that could be tweaked to better achieve its intentions.
Thank you. I advise to speak for the 468 signatories to this petition resident within my Angus and Perthshire Glens constituency. I have to tell you, Sir Edward, that's about 11 times more Angus and Perthshire Glens constituencies sign any other petition that comes from this place. And I've never, in my time in this Parliament, seen MPs perched on windowsills to be in the room for a debate taking place, such as the mass demonstrations outside or the demonstration on the South Inch in Perth just the week past at the weekend. This is fundamentally unjust. The government said they wouldn't do this, and they've gone ahead and done it, and they've applied it without any warning. There's no taper into this new regime. It gives no time for farmers to adjust their tax arrangements. It's juxtaposed diametrically to current tax advice, which is grossly unfair. It ignores that there is no actual financial enrichment, that you simply become the custodian of the asset. It doesn't get after the non-farming interests who are avoiding tax. It ignores the disproportionate effect on Scotland. It ignores the fact that a quarter of Scottish farms are tenanted. There is zero provision in the in this policy for those, and it doesn't take cognizance of the 15,000 Scottish crofts either that are grossly adversely affected by this policy. It's economically incoherent. The tax will precipitate if the tax is on the production of food. It will precipitate a reduction on investment. That will have lower yields. That will mean higher prices. That will be inflationary, which is the last thing this economy needs. And it's not just farmers who will be undone by this policy, but the entire agricultural supply chain. It undermines the reinvestment model between generation to generation, and it ignores the societal benefit of agriculture to our rural communities. And with BPR, it's a betrayal of the divestment drive that farmers are so dutifully applying themselves to over the last 20 years. And it threatens the sell-off of family farms across places like Angus and Perthshire Glens to faceless international corporations who won't leave anything positive behind, certainly not any profit. This is anti-growth. As the government now, I suspect, fully realise behind closed doors, this is a disastrous policy misstep. It plays fast and loose with the mental health of farmers. And let me echo the chorus of the National Farmers Union for Scotland, that this policy must be paused, the industry must be properly consulted, the outcome of which must be the removal of this iniquitous threat to all that we hold dear in our agricultural and rural communities and economies. And on behalf of the agricultural sector in Angus and Perthshire Glens and across the whole of Scotland, and in fact the whole of the United Kingdom, which I don't often reference in a speech, Mr Chair, this is not too late to do the right thing, and I implore the Minister to do so.
Thank
you. And it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I participated in the previous debate in the Commons chamber, and I do welcome the different tone from government backbench MPs in this debate, and they will get much further with their constituents by reflecting their concerns than reading out whips points in these debates. One issue that I want to highlight, because it goes against some of the suggestions in relation to so-called land banking, is that in my own constituency, where agricultural land is currently sold, it is acquired by private equity firms who want to go down the route of industrial tree planting or solar farm production. And if we go down the route of requiring farms to be sold to meet inheritance tax demands, farms will not be sold to new family farmers. They will not be sold to new entrants. They will be sold to these very private equity firms who want not to produce food on our land, but want to actually maximise other tax benefits that they can do under carbon offset and other environmental tax benefits that they get. And in addition to that, they don't employ anyone. They don't employ anyone within the constituency. There's no ongoing employment. And farming doesn't just produce food. It doesn't just create the generational benefits, environmental benefits, but it is at the heart of the economy. And I have seen that directly in the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak in my constituency, in which virtually every hoofed animal was destroyed in order to counter that. When farming closed down, the economy closed down. Everybody in the constituency lost out. There weren't people in the shops, there weren't people buying cars, there weren't people in other businesses. So farming isn't just about some of the things that we've heard today. It is actually right at the heart of the economy. The other point, yes, sir.
Thank you, Honourable Member for Government Way. Changes can be made to inheritance tax that will gain or will prevent people from gaming the system and buying up land to avoid tax. But that can be done without impacting on existing farming businesses. Does the Honourable Gentleman agree that for the Government not to have even considered these changes in previous responses is not only unacceptable, but it's a dereliction when it comes to food security and national security?
Well, what will be unacceptable is if the Minister stands up at the end of this debate and gives the same response to previous debates, having heard the points that his own colleagues have put forward as to how damaging, how ill thought through this policy proposal has been. And therefore, I'm looking not just for a change in tone from government backbenchers, I'm looking for a change in tone from the Minister when he responds to the date. Yes, indeed.
On that point, would my right honourable friend agree with me that the Labour leadership is in serious jeopardy of stubbornly painting itself into a corner, whereas what is needed is pragmatism, and for the Labour leadership to listen to the farmers, to the public and to its own backbenchers? And for today's debate to mean anything, for these Labour backbenchers to mean anything and their words not be cheap, it's time for the leadership to actually listen and find a way to graciously stop this farm food tax.
I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. Labour constituency MPs have listened to their constituents. That's being reflected back to us today. And now we need the Minister to listen to Labour MPs. And the other point that I would just want to get on the record myself is the point that the right honourable member, the EFRA chairman, made in relation to the very specific issue in Scotland in relation to tenanted farming holdings there, and the fact that tenanted farmers are not, if they are to raise the funds required, they would actually have to give up the whole holding, and in doing so they might not even be able to do that, and that clearly has not been thought through as part of this exercise. So, Sir Edward, to conclude, I hope that we can actually see this debate, because that's what people outside want. They want a debate to change policy. They want a debate to show that the government is listening, has heard what they have to say and will do something about it. And I hope that that will be evident in the Minister's contribution at the end.
Jim Shannon.
But, just to explain now, if you want to speak in this debate, you have to be sitting in the centre. That's why I'm over here. The only seat was available, okay? Just to declare that at the very beginning. I'm very much opposed to the agricultural farm inheritance tax, okay? And the Minister's sitting next to me. I'm going to try and nudge him a wee bit, nudge, elbow, wink, and all the things you normally do. But can I declare an interest as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union? I understand that there are some people from the Ulster Farmers Union there. I'm a landowner and a farmer in my constituency of Strangford. And I'm here to speak on behalf of the hundreds of my constituents, and the subject of which will have an effect on every single one of my constituents, whether they realise it or not. My neighbours, every one of my neighbours, the farms are passed down from generation to generation. I was sitting there just thinking as we were speaking, I can't think of one neighbour who hasn't had a farm handed down by generation, by generation, by generation. That's my neighbours. So I begin by thanking the Ulster Farmers Union, who have worked so hard in providing the information that I will very quickly speak on today, which indicates that the depth of the folly of the decision to implement inheritance tax on working farms and the devastating impact that this will undoubtedly have on food security for the entirety of the UK. The land for my neighbours, for me, for all the people that I know in the Ulster Farmers Union in Northern Ireland, the land is the lifeblood of the farmers. It is more than land, it's their very reason for existence. The Northern Ireland Irish Rural Valuers Association, in conjunction with the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, has used available data to look on the impact of October's budget proposed changes to inheritance tax. They tell me, and 6,000 farms in Northern Ireland, taxpayers they all are, will be affected by the tax change over a generation. My honourable friend for South Antrim referred to the value of the land. The value of the land in Northern Ireland is more than the value of the land here. With great respect to all my English, Scottish and Welsh compatriots, our land is better. And I say that with great friendship to all my friends in this chamber. Now, what are the solutions, Mr. Chairman? The Minister's sitting beside me. I hope he's listening. I'm sure, of course, he's listening. There's a way forward. The Ulster Farmers Union have said to me that the value of the land that was done was in the 70s, the 80s and 90s and the 90s. That gave a rateable value which is unreal for today. So can I suggest that the answer is quite simple. Take the threshold from £1 million to £5 million, and all the farmers in Northern Ireland will benefit from that. And the farmers in the rest of Wales and Scotland and England will also benefit from it, because the threshold is too low. So change the threshold. Minister, it's quite a simple one. It's to the Chancellor, and I also understand that the farmers will be meeting, I understand, the Chancellor shortly. I look forward to the outcome of that. But I tell you one thing, let's change the threshold. Let's give the farmers in Northern Ireland some hope for the future. Let's keep those farms that were handed down from generation to generation. Keep those farms. That's what this debate's all about. It is for me. I hope the Minister's listening.
Ellie Challenge.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, okay.
I rise in this debate to represent my constituency of North Herefordshire, where this is a huge issue of concern, and 914 people in my constituency have signed this. I think it's the second highest number of signatories in a constituency, and I know it's a great deal of concern because I hear from farmers in my constituency, in my surgeries. I've met dozens of them here in Parliament, and really have heard from them loud and clear just how much anxiety and distress this is causing. So I want to represent their voices here. I feel that the way that this policy has been introduced is really deeply regrettable, not only because it's caused such huge distress to the farming community, and we're all aware of the challenges, the mental health challenges that those in the farming community are facing anyway. This has made it worse. But also because this has been hugely undermining of the much more positive and constructive conversations that we desperately need to have between government and farmers to face the challenges of food production, of job generation, of tackling climate change, protecting biodiversity, all of these areas where farmers and government need to work together hand in hand for the long term. And all of that has been blown up in the air by the way that this policy has been introduced. Super frustrating. Now, in the introductory speech that the Honourable Gentleman made, he spoke about the need to consider complexity and offer solutions, and I really do agree with him. And I feel that we should be doing that in politics all the time, not just tossing insults at each other across the chamber, but really working to grapple with this. So in that spirit, if we're talking about addressing the complexity, understanding the complexity, we desperately need, you know, a set of figures that we can use as a common basis for discussion, because we've still got government saying one thing and farmers saying the other thing. Indeed, we've got the AHDB just recently saying that 76% of farmers are going to be affected by this. When are we going to get some statistics, some modelling that we can really agree with as a basis for understanding the impact of this? Sorry, I won't give way because of the demands on time. If we're talking about solutions, several have been raised already today here. Reviewing the thresholds and the rates, because as many have referred to, farmers themselves recognise the problem of the use of land as a tax loophole, but this policy doesn't plug that gap properly. We really should think about the thresholds, the impact that it's going to have on farming. Perhaps we also need to think about addressing the issues facing older farmers, those over 75, who haven't had any opportunity to engage in tax planning. But fundamentally, we've got to fix the problem of farming being insufficiently profit-making to enable people to secure their livelihoods long-term. That has got to be the focus of government policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr Morrison. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Last week I was invited to Goodens Farm in Stowborough in my constituency of Mid Dorset North Pool. Phil Randall is a third-generation farmer, and he hosted us with the other Purbeck farmers, dairy, beef and arable, and I saw the investment in his equipment, his buildings and his livestock. I was really impressed with the innovations that he's already put in place to protect himself and his business from the steep increases in fertiliser costs after the invasion of Ukraine, the investment in the care of his dairy and beef cows to improve their own welfare and his yield. And I was so excited to meet his newest calf, born by caesarean section and nurtured through his early days by him and his children. I was shocked when he told me that his farm is run entirely by him, his wife, his children and 2 members of staff, which gives me the impression that there is no money left to pay anybody else on that farm. It was really clear that Phil and the other farmers there, including Ian, Chris, Nikki and Catherine, care deeply, from the other farms, not his staff, they care deeply about their own farms, but they also care about the wider sector and protecting the countryside, ensuring food security and making sure that they have a sustainable business. And one farmer shared with me that the margins on his farm are just 1%. I can think of no other industry that would carry on with a profit margin of 1%. They are deeply angry about what happened last year, but they have now come to the conclusion that it's unlikely the Chancellor is going to U-turn. So they asked me to convey their ideas of what they want from the government. They want a consultation with them about how these changes can be modified. They recognise there are people buying up land in the countryside that are not producing food and they're not supporting environmental aims of the government to mitigate climate change. They support the introduction of a family farm tax as proposed by the Liberal Democrats and the transfer of the inheritance tax liability to the point of sale of assets and not the inheritance. They want to see a temporary relief to create time for estate planning, not just for elderly farmers, but for anyone who dies unexpectedly in the next 3 to 4 years, noting that farming is an incredibly dangerous profession at any age. They want to see institutional investors forced to be more transparent, having raised concerns about wealth being hidden in their land. They want to see APR and BPR separated with separate thresholds. Would you like to give way at that point? I'll be happy to give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. She talks about pessimism that the government will U-turn on this, but does she share my optimism that the government may well U-turn if enough of its own backbenchers make a point?
That is true. That's not really for me to say, but I hope that they're listening, and I hope. And the important thing about this is there is time. There is time. We have until April of next year, and this is why the consultation and listening to all these people here is so important. I saw just how much was being invested in tractors, muck spreaders, equipment to cut and bale the grass, milking equipment, water storage systems. If we want our farms to be more efficient and be more profitable, it is ridiculous to then charge those people the tax on the investment they're making to make their farms work better. So I'm imploring the Minister
This tax is going to harm the countryside, it's going to harm food security, and if we end up increasing imports, it will also have negative impacts on climate change and animal welfare. It is so important that you hear the message of us, of the people here and the tractors outside, and I hope that you take this opportunity to at least reform, if not scrap, this tax.
Ed Maguire.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I stand to speak on behalf of 800 signatories to this petition from my North Cornwall constituency. I also speak in this debate as chair of the all-party group for dairy. Almost all of the financial advice farmers had sought up until the budget had included APR relief in their financial planning and how they would pass on their family farms to the next generation without this ill-thought-through tax. These changes will hit the hundreds of family-run farms, many of which have been proudly looked after generation after generation by the same family. I must add, by the way, that the mental health of my North Cornwall farmers has plummeted since this was introduced. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I've had farmers in my constituency of Yeovil tell me that the government's changes to agricultural property relief have damaged their mental health, with some taking their own life. Does my honourable friend agree with me that rather than worsening the mental health crisis in farming, the government should be addressing it by scrapping this family farm tax, investing properly in rural mental health services and establishing a national working group on suicide prevention focusing on agricultural and veterinary occupations?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he won't be surprised to hear I completely agree and wholeheartedly support those suggestions. The changes haven't even taken effect yet, but their harsh effects are already on show. Surely we can urge the Minister with one voice today to look for an alternative to this ill-thought-through tax if there is no full U-turn on the horizon. This change won't hit the wealthy investors that the government had taken aim for. I urge the government... I will give way.
I don't think I can listen to many more people say this. When I questioned the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee before Christmas, he specifically said that what rich people do with their money within the rules was a matter for them, and that in creating this policy, there was no actual target audience for it. Does that not rather point to an inconsistency in messaging amongst Treasury and Downing Street?
It's a very good point from my right honourable friend, as always. And as I was saying, I would urge the Minister to look for alternatives. We've heard about the Liberal Democrats' proposal for a form of a working farm test. Other honourable members have suggested some kind of clawback scheme where the farm is sold within, say, 10 years of inheriting it. I'll draw my remarks to a close because I know other honourable colleagues want to come in, but I will just finish with this. This tax, this family farm tax, will raise around £500 million a year, not an insignificant sum. But is it a price worth paying to kill farming in this country and crucially risk our food security? Liberal Democrats have proposed restoring the cut that the Conservative Party made to the big bank levy in 2016. In contrast, this would raise around £4 billion a year and certainly puts this family farm tax into perspective. Thank you.
Graham Stewart.
Well, I do have a sense of déjà vu, because a month ago I stood here, the Minister sat there, and we hoped that the government would listen. Well, it didn't listen. I suppose, though, we should try to be optimistic, Dr Murison. That time, apart from the Minister's aide, there wasn't a single Labour MP to be found in this debate. And here they are all today. And they vary in their approach from, I don't mean to be too personal or rude to the Honourable Gentleman from South Norfolk who opened it, but I've never heard a speech in this Parliament in nearly 20 years that expressed no opinion on the subject in hand. So he gets the vanilla award. The Honourable Member for Bishop Auckland was perhaps tentative and timid, but nonetheless wanted to hint that it was possible that this perfect selection of policies put forward by Labour might need a little tweak. Well, congratulations on that, though I think the award should go to the member for Northumberland, who I think was pretty clear that he doesn't think this policy is right and it needs to be changed. Well, praise the Lord that someone on that side of the chamber is prepared to come out and do this. That's what you were sent here for. not to do whatever the Prime Minister tells you to. So, as I referred to earlier, when the 2012 budget and it wanted to bring in the caravan tax that was going to devastate the industry in East Yorkshire, which happens to be based there, and down my coast, because that's where they're deployed, we stood against it and we opposed it. And I am delighted to see that the Honourable Gentleman is going to stand up and find that inner rebel inside his heart.
There's absolutely nothing to it about what I'm telling the Honourable Gentleman when I say that farmers in my community have been massively let down by the previous government. Nothing timid at all about that. I don't know why the Honourable Lady keeps saying this. We haven't voted on this policy yet, but there was a vote. It was a vote against a motion that was put forward by the opposite side, and it was a cynical motion that was designed to make us want to vote against it because it was so ridiculous.
Well, I'm afraid he's sort of shrunk inside his outer shell, and the farmers in his constituency will have heard that. But it is possible to challenge your government. And I would say to my whips then, the best service you can do the government is to stop it doing something stupid and harmful and alienating of voters. And I would hope that members opposite could see that, because we can't change this. People outside say to me, can we get this changed? Well, it's actually up to Labour MPs. They have the majority. And part of a democracy, it's not about having a majority, you can do what you like. A democracy is listening. A democracy is, in fact, doing what the now Prime Minister told the NFU. He said, you deserve a government that listens, that heeds early warnings. Well, you know, there's one or two about. Listen, change. And if the government changes, 4 years on, no one will remember the U-turn. Whatever the civil servants tell you, they're always very keen you stick with a policy. If it's wrong, stop doing it. And this is wrong. And it is, perhaps if in the minute and 20 seconds I have left, Dr. Mearson, I just say, why is it so wrong? And we've touched on the various elements, but I'm not sure we've pulled it all together. We have a really peculiar group of business people in this country. They're called farmers. They take a return on capital, so the millions they have invested in this thing, they take a return on that, typically less than 1%. There's nobody that I'm aware of, no business I was ever involved in, would remotely consider continuing in an industry that paid less than 1%. So they take a pittance and they get up at 4 in the morning for the privilege. And they look after the animals. It doesn't matter if they're ill. They can't carry their employment rights. They go, I'm not well, I shouldn't have to go out, because the cows don't care. They have to go out, they have to look after them, and then they get less than 1% return. And these businessmen, the most beneficent, public-minded business people in the whole country, then provide excellent food at among the lowest prices in Europe. So if ever there was a business you wouldn't want to go and mess with, it's these. I shouldn't say it, I'll make enemies of them. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
The Honourable Member for his scoring system. Could I ask the Honourable Member if he could confirm if he was part of the last government that failed to get £300 million of subsidy to farmers out the door in the last government?
Well, I understand, and for his political career, having been so brave today, I entirely forgive him for that piece of whataboutery. But what we have is this. It's to understand how remarkable it is. There is this whole group of business people who take practically nothing from their business, work all the hours God gives, and provide us with among the finest food in the world at among the lowest prices in Europe. Why would you want to mess with that? And not only do they do it, do you know what they do? They brainwash their children from the earliest age so that they carry on doing it. Right. I mean, these people are in indentured service to the nation, providing food while making very little profit. And they do it willingly. In fact, they love it. It's their life. And to go and mess with them out of some socialist stupid spite is ridiculous, absurd, and the members opposite know that. The member for Northumberland certainly does, and he should lead his colleagues to tell the Chancellor, change course, just as we did in 2012 when George Osborne got it wrong. Right.
Eric Cross.
Pause of the day as well. Since the budget, since the Chancellor turned farmers' lives upside down in this country, we've heard stories from farmers across the UK. And, I mean, we'll hear more of them today. And, of course, the other side have marched out stories of their own farmers who, I mean, a few months ago, they weren't hearing anything from their farmers, but suddenly they've got a voice, and it's good to hear that they've been listening and now are actually representing their voices. But these farmers have been telling us for months the impact it's going to have. I've told you about the 90-year-old farmer in my constituency whose son is now resigned to the fact that he's going to have to sell the farm, give up on the livelihood that he thought he was going to have and the life he thought he was going to have. And I've told you about the farmers whose wife died earlier in the year, and then by the end of the year they also realised they were going to lose their farm. But the government didn't want to listen to this. They would not listen to the stories coming from our farmers. We've heard that farmers only make 1% product, as my honourable friend said. What other business would take a 1% profit and think that that's a life that they wanted to continue? And we've also heard how investment has fallen off a cliff in farms since this policy came forward. And if we don't invest in farms, if we don't encourage investment in farms, how are we going to increase profitability? Profitability and productivity are linked. If we have poor productivity, poor profitability, we are never going to get to a stage where any sort of IHT bill, let alone this one which the government are proposing, are going to be managed by farmers. But of course, it's not just farmers who've been making the government aware of where they stand. We've heard from the NFU and NFUS saying 3/4 of commercial farms will be impacted. From the CAAV, the experts in valuing, saying that 75,000 farms will be impacted. From the CLA, saying that 1/8 of farms over 350 acres will have to sell land in order to cover the bill. And we've heard from Savills, property experts, saying 88% of UK farmland will be impacted. But yet, given that the Treasury say that it's only going to be 20–25%, that's the figure we stick with. We stick with the government figure because that fits the narrative. We don't listen to the industry, we don't listen to the experts, and that is why we have got to the situation we are now. I will, of course, give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. When Jane's husband died just under 3 years ago, their farm passed to their son, the 5th generation of the family, to farm that land. Their accountant says that if that was to happen after the government's changes, that farm would be looking at an inheritance tax bill of between £80,000 and £100,000. Well, does my honourable friend know of any farm that has that kind of money available without selling off a huge chunk of their farm?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. And no, I don't. I don't know of any family farmer who has that sort of money to cover the bill. And that is the issue. We are penalising the very people who have fed us, who have supported our rural communities, who have custodied the land for generations. We are penalising them in order to fit into whatever narrative the government are trying to fit into with this policy. And the unintended consequences also have to be impacted. The impact on hauliers, on vets, on rural communities, on farm shops, on workers. All of these will be impacted because of this policy. It's not just family farmers. They are the start of this, but the result of this spreads right through rural communities, length and breadth of the country. We know this policy is... Yes, I will, yes.
I thank the Honourable Lynn for giving way. In my constituency of South Devon, we did a survey of all the farmers just to see whether the government's figures stood up. Now, the government claims that 73% of family farms will be unaffected by the change in tax relief, but 85% of the farmers who responded to our survey believe they will be affected, with an average inheritance tax bill of £637,000 because of the extortionate cost of land in South Devon. That's nearly £64,000 a year in tax every year for 10 years. Would the Honourable Lady agree that this is unworkable and will see the decimation of our family farms?
Absolutely, I 100% agree with what the honourable member is saying, and that will be repeated across the country in rural Labour constituencies, in our constituencies. It doesn't matter where you are in the country. Our farmers will be facing hundreds of thousands of pounds in high HT bills because of this government's decisions. No other reason than that. Balance sheets might say one thing, the Treasury's balance sheets might say another thing, but the reality in rural constituencies, in rural communities up and down the country is that this policy is going to devastate our family farmers and our rural communities, and the government must change course before it's too late.
Well done. To serve with you in the chair, and I also thank the Honourable Member for South Norfolk for opening the debate today. Now, it's the first time North Shropshire has been in the top 10 constituencies in a petition. 713 people have signed, and that's not surprising when you think that there are over 1,000 farms in the constituency, covering 62,000 hectares. It's one of the 20 most rural constituencies in the country. And producing food for the country is our main activity, not just in farming and the thousands of people supporting those farms, but food production, food storage and food distribution all being major industries as well. Now, farmers have had a tough time. Incomes are historically low, and those farmers can ill afford to pay inheritance tax when an estate sadly passes on. The government estimates that 288 farms will be affected in Shropshire, in North Shropshire, and even if that's not an underestimate, which we strongly suspect it is, that's a whopping 27% of the farms in my constituency. More than a quarter will have to sell off land rather than further invest in the rural economy, and that is shocking. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. These policy changes could force hundreds of family farmers in my constituency of Stratford-on-Avon to sell their productive land. Does my honourable friend agree that, as well as causing uncertainty to tenant farmers, these policies undermine our ability to address the threats to food security without discouraging those who land bank for tax purposes?
Well, I do agree with my honourable friend, and I will come on to that point in a moment. I just want to mention Robert, whose family farm has been forming a traditional mixed dairy and arable farm for 120 years near Oswestry. Their farm is valued at £6 million, which sounds like a lot, but their income is only £60,000 a year. So even if the £3 million dual relief that we've been told about by the Treasury applies, it would wipe out their income for 10 years to pay it off. And in fact, they estimate their liability would be higher than that. And it's not just traditional farms that are affected. Rental businesses, nurseries, horticultural businesses, all fearing that they can't pass on their business at the time of death as a result of this ill-thought-through policy. Now, the Chancellor wanted to put off wealthy non-farmers from buying land to avoid inheritance tax. But I reckon if you are able to get 20% with 10 years to pay it off, that's a pretty attractive alternative to paying 40% now. And with such a low threshold of £1 million, many small farmers will be left with a liability they simply can't afford to pay because land does not translate to cash unless you sell it. This tax doesn't achieve its mission at all. The idea that farms can survive this isn't true. Years of being taken for granted by the Conservatives have left farms in a desperate state. 8,000 farms shut their doors last year. That's 1 in 25. And farm incomes have been dropping year on year. It's down to a number of factors: soaring inflation, which is beyond the government's control, and the botched implementation of the SFI, which wasn't. The disastrous trade deals with Australia, New Zealand and the CPTPP have set an alarming precedent, especially when the President of the United States is holding anyone to ransom who doesn't give him what he wants in terms of trade tariffs. The government must protect the farming budget. We need our family farms to thrive, for economic growth, which is so crucial in rural areas, to produce our food and to protect our environment. There is still time to reverse this disastrous decision. I urge the government to listen to these valid concerns and demonstrate its commitment to rural Britain. Let's axe this family farm tax.
John Cooper.
Under your chairmanship, I represent Dumfries and Galloway, which is the land of milk and slurry, with due deference to the honourable member from Strangford with his super valuable land. We actually have some of the most productive grassland in the whole of the country. The point that the farmers there make to me all the time, and they are not, by the way, the large estates, they are small, very often tenant farmers. The point they make to me is that Treasury ministers, like accountants, very often know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I think that's the situation here. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about what these reliefs are. They are not loopholes. They were specifically put in place to allow multi-generational farming to continue. And if I can, I'll quote one of my farmers, Robert, who farms near Money Ive. He said, APR and BPR has been suggested, loopholes, but targeted and necessary reliefs designed to allow multi-generational farming businesses to contribute towards food production and economic growth. Absolutely.
We've heard from this side several attempts at projecting possible tweaks to the legislation and feedback from our members. But on that point about loopholes, I don't think anyone is saying that family farms have tried to abuse loopholes. It's those big billion corporation and land bankers that have actually started to exploit it.
They've repeatedly called it a loophole. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, but as he's hearing from this side, it's been repeatedly called a loophole. And I have been told in the chamber that I am scaremongering. That's not right either. This is nonsense. The fear out there is real. Listen to the noise outside. These are people outside who are not multi-millionaires. They are not shroud waving for the sake of it, and they are not people who are exploiting a loophole. It's a little bit like red diesel, and again, the Minister, I suspect, doesn't even know what red diesel is. Red diesel is priced cheaply, and that has a direct linkage and a direct effect on the price of food that we pay in our shops. The whole system is designed to try to ensure food security first and foremost, and secondly, to deliver quality food at low prices. We've heard about tweaks and so forth. It's not for me to suggest tweaks. The government is in power with a huge majority. It must think again, and it's not, as I say, for me to sit down and write out specifics for them. They have the ability not to make a great screeching U-turn, but to make the tweaks that can actually protect this most important and vital industry. Will the Minister please take away the message that he's heard today, and there is a change of tone from the benches behind him, that this is a real, serious problem and changes can be made. It is not too late. Thank you.
Well done. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Now, farmers are descending in Whitehall today for the third time in as many months, and we all here, I suspect, know that the government's proposals to change both APR and BPR, not forget, have been an exercise in failure, a failure in political judgment, communication, and based on the latest OBR analysis, not even going to achieve policy outcomes either. And I know that there have been suggestions from a number of members around different ways of mitigating this impact, but I point out today that there was a report that £500 million is being spent in costs to HMRC, additional costs in recouping tax, and that, funnily enough, is the same as the £500 million that this policy is estimated to bring into the Treasury. So maybe we need less loopholes, simpler tax, and a way to help working people in this country. I want to raise an issue that a number of members have raised, including the member of the Select Committee, which is about agricultural tenancies and particularly their impact in Scotland. Now, agricultural tenancies have an inheritable value. There are circumstances where a tenancy can be passed on via will, the rules of intestate, or some conditions as a lifetime gift. But this is not purely a Scottish occurrence, but it is many, many times more common in Scotland because of the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 1991. And any tenancy which this law applies to can be passed on by the tenant as part of their estate. The tenancy is valued per acre as the difference between market rates and what the actual rent is, because these tenancies have much lower preferential rates. And according to the CAAV, and I know they've written to the Chancellor about this, it means that the average value of lowland arable land, for example, would be £3,000 to £4,000 per acre, and I'm grateful to them for explaining it. That means a tenancy of 300 acres breaches the APR threshold and they start paying APR, and that's before taking into account the value of machinery. Whilst we've heard broad concerns about the future of farms if they're forced to sell land piecemeal, this just isn't an option available to tenant farmers. Now, it's complicated and it's technical, but I do think the government just haven't thought about the impact on Scottish tenant farmers. I've raised this 4 times in the last 3 months, both at Scotland Office questions and indeed the urgent question that the Minister replied to a couple of weeks ago, and I got platitudes. I don't think they have looked at this at all. And I'm conscious that we are talking about farmers and this perception that farmers are wealthy. I think we've made it clear in the chamber today that this is about people who have cash held in their land, but they cannot release that without selling it. But I just want to conclude, Dr Marsden, by saying the last constituent I spoke to last week, who was a farmer, was previously a tenant farmer, had bought her farm 8 years ago with her family under a mortgage, and is now transitioning from working tax credits to universal credits. We need to deal with that myth, and I urge the government to pause this policy.
Thank you, Chair. I've heard no one in this debate defend a land banking corporation. But what I have heard in this debate is many members objecting to genuine farmers being treated in the same way as if they were the land banking corporations. That is fundamentally wrong, and therein is the basic flaw in this proposal. Chair, I think it should be useful to cast our minds back as to why 40 years ago this concession was introduced. And it was for 2 reasons. we were told at that time. Two reasons which still apply today. It was to enable retention by the next generation, and it was to allow long-term planning without fear of a crippling death tax. Those two reasons were good then. They are equally good today. But now we've arrived at a situation where the government tell us, or some of them do, that they're bringing this in to chase the land banking corporations, but they've got a policy which, if implemented, will enhance the land banking of those corporations, because it is the small, genuine family farms that won't be able to meet the tax that will sell. And who will the buyers be? The buyers will be the land banking corporations. So it is a self-defeating policy, if that is the purpose of it. And it's a policy which is going to cripple many family farms. The government tell us, oh, it will only affect 500 farms a year. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Rural Valuers Association, a body of professional valuers, have done a massive piece of work on this. And they have concluded that in Northern Ireland alone, there will be 200 farms affected per annum. Now, if the total is meant to be 500, and Northern Ireland, which is only a 40th of this nation, can produce 200 in a year, then I think it's quite clear that the government is wholly wrong in their statistics and in their evaluation. And I do say to this government, and frankly, my farmers aren't particularly interested in Labour chiding the Tories and the Tories chiding Labour about who did what when. They're interested in getting a solution. And I say to this government, strong government is not about driving through because you've got a big majority, the policy you have. Strong government is about doing what's right. And it is patently right here to have the courage to acknowledge that this is a flawed policy, and therefore the government needs to find reverse gear. I trust they do.
Under your chairmanship. The petition that we debate has been signed by 494 of my constituents. Many of those who are signatories will be farmers operating on multi-generational farms across Cheshire. But signing alongside these farmers and families, there are many more who are deeply concerned about the changes to agricultural property relief and its wider impact. Shop owners, food producers, and the wider local economy, which will suffer as a result of this policy. Our community has come together to speak up because people understand how important farming is to our local economy, to our food security, and for the sustainability of our countryside. Without farming, the local economy in Chester South and Eddisbury would greatly suffer. And I would like to briefly share some of the knock-on impacts from this ill-thought-through policy. In Cheshire, we have some of the best beef and dairy stock in the country. We have therefore attracted national and multinational suppliers who have brought millions of pounds into our economy. Perhaps you had a Muller yoghurt for breakfast this morning. It was probably produced in Chester, in my constituency, with Cheshire dairy produce. Or maybe you enjoyed some Cheshire cheese for lunch, again, a product of the Cheshire food industry. I can personally recommend Cheshire ice cream, without doubt the best in the country. Suppliers and manufacturers from across Cheshire provide a significant boost to our local economy. They are employers, innovators and investors, but they cannot do what they do without the supply produced by farmers. Cheshire food produce is vital to some of our best-loved brands, but like many rural areas, it is the independent retailers and high street shops that often stimulate our economy the most. Without sustainable local produce, shops will lose the USP that sets them apart, and our local economy will suffer as a result. Less than a fortnight ago, I was delighted to welcome my right honourable friend, the leader of His Majesty's opposition, to my constituency. We started the day at Top of the Town Farm in Broomhall, farmed by Richard Davenport, his son Sam, and his father John. 3 generations working together, and one of many local examples of a multi-generational dairy farm sharing knowledge from one generation to the next, learning, innovating, and growing the farm whilst employing people locally. And yet the incentives to invest in capital on the farm, to invest in measures to improve sustainability and to ensure the continuation of farming for the long term, all under serious threat as a result of this policy decision. Mr. Chairman, the economic case is clear. but I also want to briefly mention the impact on rural and agricultural communities' mental health. Farmers face adversity, challenges and stress every single day. There is little that they can control, and this budget now has taken away their one security to leave their farm to the next generation. The implications on mental health have already been seen in the most tragic of circumstances. We must all stand together and tell the government that we must stop the family farm tax.
Steph Aquaron.
I'm speaking today on behalf of the 392 signatories from North Norfolk and our wider community as a whole. A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of spending Saturday morning with farmers outside a supermarket in my constituency, and I think a lot of people who might not have been supportive of their cause initially really appreciated this opportunity to hear directly from farmers. North Norfolk has historically relied heavily on agriculture for employment and economic prosperity. And we still have a lot of agricultural employment, but the knock-on is felt in other sectors too. Farmers supply local businesses with high-quality, locally sourced produce. They're custodians of our natural environment, and more are using their land for sustainable farming as well as for natural flood management to protect the wider community. Farming is a beating heart, ever present at the core of our rural economy. The changes the government are proposing run a very real risk of ripping that heart out altogether. While our area is diversifying in a number of innovative and exciting ways, the simple fact is that our farmers will always be there to put food on the table. Keeping farming alive locally allows us also to be part of the exciting progress that science and agriculture can make together. With the Norwich Research Park in my honourable neighbour's constituency, very, very near to us, and the incredible agri-science which they are undertaking, family farms in Norfolk are the perfect testbed for the latest in gene editing crops, which can bring about higher yields, lower carbon footprints, and less need for pesticides. This isn't a debate about protecting exemptions for multimillionaires and tax dodgers. If the government had proposals to truly tackle this issue, I would be fully supportive, and I'm sure my local farmers would be too. However, this proposal would be hugely damaging for family farmers who, year on year, generation on generation, hope to stay in a business, made virtually unprofitable after years of government failure, are being dragged into a punitive tax due to spiralling land costs that are out of their control. If these were greedy individuals looking to duck tax, they would have left this tough industry many years ago. Taking on a relentless job with hard, lonely labour in all weathers, which has skyrocketing rates of suicide, would not be done just for tax exemption. They do it because they value the family farm, the people they employ, the supply chains they support, and the communities they've served for generations. I urge the government, listen to farmers, listen to their communities, and think again.
Charlie Dewhurst.
Thank you, Chair. Can I first thank the petitioner and the hundreds of people in my constituency of Bridlington and Wolds, Bridlington and the Wolds that signed it. Now, as was very eloquently put by my right honourable friend, the member for Beverley and Holderness, it is very encouraging to see many more MPs from the government benches here today, and I mean that genuinely because, as we say, previous debates have been a little bit sparse on that side. I hope it is a sign that things are slowly turning and there may be some change to come. And the member for South Norfolk said that we shouldn't be treating this as a political football, a message that didn't quite reach the honourable member for Bishop Auckland behind him. But I do agree that although it has become a political football, the problem is it's because the people outside right now feel they have not been listened to by this government. Those concerns, the reason why we have hundreds of tractors, thousands of people outside on Whitehall again is because they feel their voice is not being heard. It's the reason why we are in here and they are out there, because nobody has listened to them up to this point. Now, I'd like to go back to a point that was well made by the NFU President in front of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee in December, when he said that the government should set the sector the exam question. What are you trying to achieve here? Because then the sector can work with government to reach that agreed point. That will either be to prevent land banking by very wealthy individuals or to raise revenue to support rural public services. Whichever that is, let's get round the table and let's find a solution that works for all. But I fear the Treasury have become like modern-day flat earthers, fighting, holding their position in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, whether it's agricultural organisations, tax experts, supermarkets, MPs from across the political divide are questioning the impact of this tax. And we know the modelling doesn't take into account the full impact of business property relief. It largely focuses on those agricultural property relief claims. And we know many people, including tenants and other businesses, other family businesses, other farming businesses, will only use a BPR claim and not an APR claim. And that is why we do need to look at this again in its entirety. So I ask, once again, I almost, dare I say, beg the Minister, please, pause this process. Let's get round the table with the farming organisations, the farming representatives, and let's find a better way forward.
I'd remind colleagues that I hope those who want to speak are on my list. If you are on the list, that's great, but you must bob also, otherwise I will assume you no longer wish to speak. Brian Matthews.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Morrison. Earlier today, I had the opportunity to meet with a constituent of mine, Darcy Johnson, and I'd like to share her and her family's story with you today. 4 generations of Darcy's family have worked Dogwood Farm. This is a small, family-run beef and arable farm of about 250 acres. Her grandfather is the current owner, with the plan always being to follow the sensible business advice that they and other farmers were given to wait until her grandfather's death to pass the farm on to the next generation. Her parents currently manage the farm, and Darcy herself is studying agricultural business, hoping to later take it on herself. Generations worth of planning has followed the suggested advice, and that was suddenly changed overnight with the budget announcement. As her grandfather is now 92, beyond insurable age, they do not have 7 years to wait. If this plan comes into effect unchanged, Darcy and her family will have to somehow find nearly £500,000 to keep their farm with barely any notice. If they cannot do this, as they, like most small farmers, do not have hundreds of thousands of pounds to spare, they will lose their farm, a small, sustainable family business that will likely be replaced by a corporate with no connection to the local community. The government needs to acknowledge the effect that this sudden rise in inheritance tax will have on small family farms. People whose families have been working hard for generations to put food on Britain's tables.
Would the honourable member give way?
I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. It's a fundamental principle that legislation should not be retrospective. But here we have a tax that requires farmers to have acted 7 years before they ever knew that the tax was going to exist. It's fundamentally wrong, and I ask the government to withdraw this measure.
Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for those comments. These small family-run businesses cannot afford this, and if the plan continues, many will be wiped out completely. These farms are often the backbone of their rural communities, doing everything from clearing snow in the winter to providing hay bales for village fairs. The loss of these farms will not only devastate the families that own them, but completely change rural life in England. I would argue for the worse. Farmers like Darcy, who is here with us and travelled up for the day to make her voice heard, need to be given a seat at the table so that they can give useful advice to the government on how to dig themselves out of the hole that they have unfortunately dug for themselves. Thank you.
Caroline Voden.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. And I rise to speak on behalf of the 477 people in South Devon who signed this petition, which is almost exactly the same as the number of farms in my constituency. I think it's very clear from the number of people in this room and the number of people outside the strength of feeling there is about this tax, a tax which has caused severe distress across the farming community and yet is expected to raise only around £115 million a year, which is less than 0.01% of government spending, or less than 0.3% of the tax rises announced in the budget. So I ask the Minister, do you think it's really worth all the pain for that amount of gain? We've talked a lot about farmers today, but we know that the rural economy is heavily dependent on farmers and is much wider than just the farmers themselves. So the impact of this is going to be enormous in rural communities like mine. The knock-on effect will affect feed, equipment and machinery suppliers, agricultural engineers, the shops that stock high-quality local meat and vegetables, seasonal employment and all those who benefit from the visitors who camp on farms or stay on farm-based holiday accommodation. And I would urge the Minister to think about this as well. But not only this, farmers are key to tackling climate change and the nature crisis and absolutely crucial to our food security. So why do we want to place them under yet more pressure after all the challenges they've already faced under the last decade? The damaging trade deals, the poor transition to elms, a botched deal with the EU that has limited their ability to export, higher input and energy prices and, of course, floods. This is a toxic mess for farmers, so we carried out a survey of all the farms in my South Devon constituency to find out exactly what the reality is on the ground for them in the face of this tax change. 85% who responded to our survey believe they will be affected by the changes. 90% of the farms are likely to be inherited by the direct descendants of the current owner. The average farm value is 4.15 million, with the highest being 15 million. Remember, the price of land in the South Hams is some of the highest in the country. Farmers didn't cause those land prices to skyrocket. The influx of rich second homeowners and the honeypot effect has done that, and now farmers in my constituency are going to have to pay for it. The average bill in South Devon will be £637,000. That's nearly £64,000 tax every year for 10 years. This tax will not only decimate the family farms of South Devon, but it will have a major knock-on effect on food production. One farmer said, "The policy as it currently stands will halve food production in a generation." And I have hundreds of quotes that I can't read out, but a quote from a family whose farm has been in their family since the Doomsday Book, and they've said they will have to sell at least 25% of the farm assets, and it may mean that their children are unable to inherit a farm which goes back further than they can even... back to the Doomsday Book. Thank you.
Ross Savage.
It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. I want to start by quoting Dwight Eisenhower. "Farming looks mighty easy when your plough is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles away from the cornfield." Too often this government appears to be 1,000 miles away from the cornfield. I urge them to review their changes to the agricultural property relief, to listen to farmers and put their needs and the best interests of this country front and centre. This is a subject that has aroused very strong emotions in my constituency of the South Cotswolds. In the South Cotswolds, we have both ends of the spectrum, many small family farms and also Dyson's UK HQ. Our 750 farm holdings employ over 2,000 people, including Mike, who is in the gallery today, who all demonstrably contribute to feeding our country and caring for our natural environment. And these farmers are distraught. As we seek to reverse the destruction of nature in our severely nature-depleted country, it's clear that we need the participation of the sector that manages 70% of our land.
I will give way. On that point. So I thank the honourable friend for giving way. A small farmer with land near Frampton Cotterill in my Thornbury and Yate constituency highlighted that as well as high land costs, some of the machinery they need to actually farm that land costs upwards of £100,000. Does my honourable friend agree that if farmers are going to have the confidence to invest in the modern sustainable farming practices that are needed, that we need a policy that recognises the high capital, low income nature of farming?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. A good point, well made. From waking up before the crack of dawn in the lambing and calving seasons to finishing the working day often beyond midnight during the harvest, it's not hard to recognise the long and draining hours that farmers put in, the huge financial pressures that they work under, and the toll that this lifestyle takes on their mental and physical health. Farmers have to be able to plan for the long term, with their predictions, meteorological, financial, logistical and agricultural, having impacts for generations to come. So, being such forward planners, it came as a great surprise and not a pleasant one during Labour's autumn 2024 budget, having been promised by the current government when in opposition that there would be no change to APR, to hear that they would indeed be subjected to a change in inheritance tax. And I thank my honourable friend for the point that he made earlier about the injustice of retrospective legislation. I will.
I think she's making an excellent speech, but some of the farmers in my constituency are concerned that Liberal Democrats have talked about a land tax and wealth tax, and I wonder if she would tell us how that would affect the farmers in her constituency and mine.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and that is not Liberal Democrat policy anymore. Thank you. The government claims that it's targeting the big wealthy landowners, not family farmers. And it says that once inheritance tax allowances are taken into account, most farms will not be affected. But here's what I don't understand. On the one hand, the government is saying that it needs to raise money to fill a big black hole. On the other hand, it's saying that most farms will not be affected by this change. It can't have it both ways. Likewise, the government says that only 25% of farms will be affected, while the National Farmers Union says 75% of farmers will be. We seem to have two parallel realities here, and never the twain shall meet. Persisting with this policy is bad for our family farms. It's bad for our food security. It's bad for nature. It's bad for future generations. I beg this government to reconsider and have the good grace to back down on this disastrous miscalculation.
James McMurdoch.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morrison. Now, like many here, I have prepared a short speech, but I thought what I'd rather do is pull out some of the highlights from this, because this has actually probably been the most interesting debate I've been involved in. All the more interesting for being rather one-sided. So if we go through food security first and foremost, this will achieve the opposite. Now really I could stop there, but if we carry on, forced to sell, bought by private equity firms, half of our food production could be lost within a generation, hugely damaging to mental health, and I say with all sadness and somberness that I believe that lives have been lost already, damaging and ill thought through. Laws should not be done retrospectively, which is a very fine point raised. Farmers should have had to have been aware of this 7 years ago in order to be in a good position today for this change. And I just add to that point, this was, as I understand it, a breach of a promise as well. If it's wrong, stop doing it, which makes pretty good sense to me. It's a self-defeating policy because it won't raise the money it's supposed to and may in fact be rather counterproductive. And that brings me to the rather limited experience I've had with farmers in my own constituency. I'm South Basildon and East Thurrock, where we don't have a huge amount of farmland, but where we do have them, they share the exact same concerns as the rest of the country. One gentleman was sharing the story of his finances with me, and this is essentially every penny their farm will make over the next decade. And guess what his point was? He was not concerned in the least bit about money for himself. He was concerned about investing in his business. And what we also have in Essex is a rather large New Holland plant. And if our farms do not have any money to invest in their business, businesses like New Holland, which produce these £200,000–300,000 vehicles, will not have any customers. So I'm very, very interested to hear what the Minister has to say at the end of this, because as I understand it, he's a reasonable man, and I hope he has reasonable things to say. But from my perspective, and I believe from the perspective of reform, this is a disastrous new policy, and I hope they change course.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Labour's family farm tax will be a disaster for hard-working farmers in Ely and East Cambridgeshire and across the country, farmers who've already suffered under years of Conservative cuts. This new tax policy threatens to devastate farms nationwide, potentially forcing families to sell the land that they've farmed for generations. As we've heard today, farming isn't just a job, it's a way of life, a legacy passed down through generations. By imposing this tax, we risk breaking this cycle and undermining the very foundation of our agricultural industry. I've met with farmers across Ely and East Cambridgeshire, and they feel angry and dismayed. More than that, they're hurt because they feel their voices aren't being heard and their concerns are being ignored. The impact of this tax was brought home to me when I visited a family farm in my constituency, sitting round the kitchen table with 3 generations. The 3rd generation who'd handed the farm to the 4th generation, who were now unsure if they could hand it on to the 5th generation without inheritance tax, an inheritance tax bill which couldn't be paid from the farm's income. They'd shown me round the development various generations had made to the farm: hedgerows, ponds, a horse riding facility for the local community. Many of these could be lost to raise funds to pay the inheritance tax, or lost if the land was sold on. These people, remember, feed us and care for vast areas of our green and pleasant land, yet we allow wholesale food prices to be kept low, make them compete with foreign food imports produced to lower standards, and reduce agricultural support grants. We stand by while climate change delays their planting, reduces their harvests, and increases pests and disease. Making farmers pay inheritance tax could be the final straw for British farms. The government needs to restore the inheritance tax exemptions to save our family farms.
Amos.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I rise to speak up for the 337 signatories to this petition from my Taunton and Wellington constituency. One thing we should have learned, and I hope the Treasury surely must have learned, is that farms are asset rich, but they are cash poor, and that especially applies to smaller family farms. Treasury figures have therefore underestimated when they talk about only 27% of farms being affected. As the NFU have pointed out, it's more like 75% because government figures often leave out that both business property relief and agricultural property relief are both affected. It means that more farms will be affected since that maximum allowance, applies to both combined. But more importantly, Dr. Morrison, this measure fundamentally misunderstands that the value of a farm is wrapped up in the land and is not just about pounds and pence. It's about the integrity of that farm. And if you start selling off chunks of that farm piecemeal, time after time, you eliminate the value of that farm in many ways as a whole. And the government really needs to accept the damage that this family farm tax could do. The Minister might say, well, this can be borrowed. Why don't they just borrow the money and pay it off over time? Well, Ed Hawkins came to see me from Cutsey Farm in Troll and explained that if he was to annualise that payment over a number of years, it would wipe out the very small margin that they depend upon to live, as we've heard from other members in the chamber today. It's not realistic. Robbie Vile came to see me with his son, Charlie, from High Lilston Farm in North Curry. Charlie's hoping to go into farming, but then looking at how farming has been treated recently, the delays in the SFI payments, the underspend of a full $358 million over the last 3 years of the agricultural budget, massive advantage given to Australia and New Zealand cheap imports after Brexit, and now inheritance tax. Why would any young person be encouraged to go into farming in those circumstances, they ask? I'd be more than happy to.
The Honourable Gentleman, does he agree with me that it would be very useful for the Minister in his reply if he were to say from the Treasury front bench what profitability, the average profitability there is in British farming? Because it would just be useful on the record, because it's in that context that you have to look at this, and if you don't see that in context, you just compare it with other businesses, you can easily mislead yourself as to the reality for farmers across the country.
I agree, and that would be a very useful statistic, and if the Minister isn't willing to look it up, I hope he might ask the House of Commons Library to do so, because I feel it would certainly reveal the vast number of farms that would be affected by the scale of the tax that's being proposed for them. In short, I have no objection. In fact, I would support the taxing of super large landowners using this as a loophole to avoid inheritance tax. But the irony of this policy is it will drive more land into the hands of those super large landowners, because every time they have to sell off some of their land, it will go to one of these bigger companies. And drawing this land, seeing this land being sold piecemeal time after time is only going to damage British farming as a whole. Drawing this tax down to some of the smallest family farms in Taunton and Wellington and across the country is unjust. It won't raise the money the government says it will raise. It will mean piecemeal disposal of farms up and down the country. And the government really must raise the threshold for this policy or extend the transitional relief. And if it doesn't do that, then the policy needs to go, and it needs to go now, and that's what the Liberal Democrats would do.
Yeah. Well, colleagues, we have some time available, so I'm prepared to give a bit of latitude to the front bench speeches. I would suggest an indicative 15 minutes, starting with the Liberal Democrat spokesman, Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair and to speak on behalf of the Liberal Democrats on this incredibly important issue. Now, I'd like to thank all of the Right Honourable and Honourable members for their contributions. It highlights very clearly the strength of feeling from around the country. Now, I'd also like to thank the petitioners, especially the 520 from Glastonbury and Somerton. Now, Dr. Morrison, as has been well rehearsed, British agriculture is staring over a cliff edge, suffering from an almost never-ending list of difficulties over recent years, like Brexit, like energy prices, like the war in Ukraine, the terrible Tory trade deals, and a botched transition from BPS to ELMS. And now, against this background, the government's decision to implement changes to the APR and BPR has rightly drawn criticism and anger from across the sector. The Liberal Democrats are deeply concerned about the impact the family farming tax will have on farmers and rural communities right across the country. Dr. Morrison, I am in constant dialogue with farmers from across Glastonbury and Somerton. A consistent message from many is that this decision will inevitably lead to many family farms closing their gates for the very last time over the next few years. Just this weekend, I met with a farmer's son in his 40s on his family farm in Low Ham. He explained that he was hoping to move away from his career as a civil engineer and go back to the farm full-time, keeping the beef suckler herd at the heart of the business, but introducing diversification projects to maintain a baseload of income for when agricultural markets fluctuate. He told me that the changes to the IHT, and I quote, will be the end of any chances we have of keeping our farm going. I feel totally demoralised. Yes, of course.
Very grateful to the Honourable Member, and I think she's really outlining the impact of this policy. On the example she gave in terms of a constituent, I think one of the things that we think about from farms is that multi-generational element and the fact that often those families live together. The government has often said the farmers should be considering tax planning, but one of the challenges with tax planning is a donor can't keep any benefit from the gift. Do we think that the government is intending to suggest that older parent farmers who do tax plan need to move out of the farm?
I thank my honourable friend for a very well-made point, and indeed farming is often multi-generational. The stress this is putting on those farming families. I myself am from a farming family. My mother is 81. My father died just about a year ago. The pressure that this is putting on her to think whether she can survive another 7 years is so distressing, and I know that she is not alone. Thank you.
Is she concerned, as I am, that for very good reason we do not apply tax to food? Therefore, presumably by the same very good reason, we should not apply tax to the production of food, because does it not amount to the same thing?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I agree. So levels of farming, confidence in farming in the community are at a worrying low ebb. The National Audit Office reports that only 1 in 3 farmers are confident that DEFRA and its agencies can deliver their proposed changes to schemes and regulations. It's also clear that the family farm tax will only increase pressure on farmers while burdening extra uncertainty and anxiety on farmers that are already suffering with their mental health. Dr. Murison, today marks the beginning of Mind Your Head Week. Now in its 8th year, it's a campaign that amplifies mental health awareness, and it's run by the Farm Safety Foundation and the Yellow Wellies. This year's themes are love, positivity and resilience. 3 characteristics we should show to our farmers. Recently, the OBR assigned any revenue from this tax with a high uncertainty rating, stating that any yield from this measure is not likely to reach a steady state for at least 20 years. In addition, the Treasury also indicated that the combined changes to APR and BPR are projected to raise approximately £520 million annually. But using HMRC figures on the total cost of each relief, the Liberal Democrats have calculated that proportion attributed to APR changes is only going to be around £115 million, confirming that this misguided tax will penalise British farmers for essentially no benefit. The report reiterates that it will place an impact on older farmers. They will be hit hardest, as they will find it difficult to quickly put in place the transitional restructure to their affairs in response to the pending changes. Now, Dr. Morrison, I spoke recently to a farmer from Martock who told me that their parents, who are in their late 80s, are horrified by this tax raid. They don't want to lose their home and their business, but the lack of time to implement the changes make this their sad reality. They implore the government to consult on the transitional arrangements that works with them and for them. Now, I fear that these family farms will instead be broken up and parcels of land will be sold off at what will likely be a deflated land value by already wealthy landowners who are simply just going to add to their already large land portfolios. Yes, of course I will.
Speech and to confirm the issue that she's referring to, Mr. Chairman, is the issue of the stress to those of an elderly generation, the mums and dads, those of a generation who are probably getting ready for the future and settling themselves into handing the land over to their family. The stress, the anxiety, the depression that it brings, and the Honourable Lady has been to the forefront in addressing the issues of mental health in the countryside. It's not just the young farmers who will feel and this system. It'll also be the mums and the dads, the aunts and uncles, the grannies and the grandads.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point, and indeed a recent survey shows that 95% of young farmers under 40 see that mental health is their biggest concern. It's so significant. Now, I agree with farmers in Glastonbury and Somerton who feel that the thresholds are set far too low, with some telling me that the figures that the government have arrived at are just plain insulting. Many farms have a land value that is way in excess of any returns that can be earned on their land. As we've heard, farmers are capital rich, but they are asset poor. A dairy farmer near Bruton has been in the family farm for 5 generations, and over 100 years they've told me that they already struggle to make a living as it is, without trying to face the prospect of their thousands of pounds each year having to be eked away from their business when they pass away. Their son is wanting to come into that farm business, and it's going to destroy his chances of success and will destroy everything that they have worked so hard for throughout their lives. They've worked to secure the business for the next generation. And what's so galling is that the family farm tax will fail to address the key issues of land being snapped up by wealthy individuals as a tax haven. So I, like others, are desperately concerned about the actual number of farmers that will be impacted by the IHT changes. The government resolutely refers to a figure of only 500. But Dr. Morrison, in my view, one farm is one farm too many. But my point is that where has this figure come from? The government claim it's from the OBR, but the OBR say it's not the case. So if it's not, then perhaps the Minister today could confirm how and when this figure has originated from.
Would you give way on that point?
Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's doing an excellent job of summing up. I just wonder if she would agree with me that lots of residential houses in rural areas like mine have a couple of acres at the back of them, which they might be using just for hobby farming, if you like. They're not commercially viable. If the Treasury have taken those into account, they're going to have grossly underestimated the impact of this, aren't they?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she's absolutely right. Many in the industry feel that this figure has been vastly underestimated, with inflation likely to bring yet more over the threshold within the next generation. Dr. Morrison, I hope that the government will look again at the modelling to see how they can protect family farms and actually target those using agricultural land to avoid paying tax. Instead, the Liberal Democrats urge the government to reconsider and raise revenue more fairly for public services by reversing the Conservatives' tax cuts for big banks, increasing the remote gaming duty on online gambling profits, and raising the digital service tax on social media companies and tech giants. And support British farming by investing £1 billion annually in profitable, sustainable and nature-friendly farming, and reducing trade barriers with Europe, including a comprehensive veterinary agreement, while also strengthening the Groceries Code adjudicator to protect consumers and farmers from unfair price rises, whilst supporting our producers. The food security of the nation is imperative to national security. But I fear these latest measures may negatively impact on this. It's deeply, deeply disappointing that after years of the Conservatives taking rural communities for granted, we now see more of the same from this government. So I urge the Minister to rethink his attitude towards farming and rural communities. Dr. Morrison, my colleagues and I on the Liberal Democrat benches will be fighting tooth and nail to make sure no family farm receives a hammer blow to their business from these changes. So to echo my right honourable friend from Orkney and Shetland, the Minister, please pause and reconsider.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. So here we are again. As we speak, thousands of farmers are once again rallying outside the gates of this building. Over the past 6 months, our farmers have repeatedly been told by this Labour government that their way of life is expendable, that their hard work, their sacrifice, their future can simply be priced up and taken away. So is it any wonder why our farmers have shown up in such vast numbers again today? And make no mistake, Mr. Chairman, it is not just our farmers outside these gates. Across the country, more than 148,000 people have signed the petition because they know, just as we do on these benches, that the family farm tax is wrong. It is vindictive and it must be scrapped now. So I use this opportunity whilst talking about the petition to thank the Honourable Member for South Norfolk for leading this petitions debate. But I have to say, Dr. Morrison, that I believe that he did a staunch disservice to those petitioners who put their faith in him to lead this debate by not actually forming any opinion based on the strong arguments that he absolutely communicated but didn't form an opinion. Just a mere spokesman, not using his opportunity in this debate to voice properly their concerns. And I must say, what an image for our farming community to take away from today's debate. Where on earth is the Secretary of State for DEFRA? We have the Shadow Secretary of State sat beside me. Where on earth is the Farming Minister? Absent. And what message does it send that the Labour Party have clearly filled the benches up on the other side of this House, but only 4 members of the Labour Party spoke in this debate, despite having an opportunity to voice their concerns in this petitions debate, which effectively is a 3-hour debate, of which, Mr Chairman, all 5 of them that spoke voted against scrapping the family farm tax when we brought the motion to the House last time. So this is probably one of the most important debates that we can have on this issue, but yet once again, those with responsibility for rural areas and our farmers are missing in action. Indeed, Mr Chairman, there is Labour members on the other side of the House that have turned up but not even contributed in this debate, yet representing such vast, large rural constituencies. So where is this government that claims to be on the side of rural Britain? Because if they had actually visited some of their farming communities, they would know just how damaging their choice is to implement the family farm tax is on our farming community. They may have had some of the devastating conversations that I, and indeed many on this side of the House, have had, including the Shadow Secretary of State, have had on this issue. And I would like to go through or share some of them. Mr Chairman, just last week I was in Northamptonshire and I met George. George has worked on his farm all of his life, and he is nearly in his 80s. And he, right now, unfortunately, is extremely ill. He knows, through his diagnosis, that he hasn't got long to live, but he isn't sure right now, as I speak, if he'll live beyond April 26. He knows that should he pass away before April 26, his IHT bill will be 0. But if he passes away after April 26, his tax bill to his family will be well over £1 million, a debt which his family simply cannot sustain. Now, Mr Chairman, taking his own life was an option which was put forward to me. Mr Chairman, these are horrific choices, unthinkable amounts of pressure for any individuals or families to be put under, never mind some of the most vulnerable in our society, and I will give way.
Who's giving a very powerful speech. It's true that George was given no notice, was he? No ability to plan for this absolute and important impact on his life and everything he's worked for. But isn't it worse than that? Because explicitly he relied on a promise not to do this, and that makes it particularly unforgivable.
And I could not agree more. I will just answer this point before giving way. I cannot agree more with the point that has just been made by my right honourable friend, because what the electorate was sold was false promises in the run-up to the general election. They were specifically told that this Labour government would not change agricultural property relief, but that is exactly what they have done. So I will ask the Minister, how will he communicate with George? What does he tell George based on the promises that were given in the run-up to the general election? And will he acknowledge, for I can't believe how many times I have asked this, will the government commit to recording suicide statistics across the farming sector as we move closer to April 26? And if the Minister is so determined to carry on with his family farming death tax, will the Minister at least look at changing the abruptness of this tax's implementation to protect the most vulnerable in our farming community? It cannot just be right that this government is forcing people into these decisions to make. Mr Chairman, another point that has been made is that this tax also hits our next generation. There are young people that we need to be powering our industry forward to the future. So what did the Minister say to Gemma, the granddaughter of a lifelong farmer who has been forced to split up their family's farm, leaving their future in doubt. What does the Minister say to the thousands of young farmers up and down the country, indeed many of those who are right outside this building now, who are in similar situations because of this government's choices? Indeed, I spoke to a few of them outside before coming into this House. Indeed, these concerns have also been raised by the member, my right honourable member, the member for Dumfries and Galloway and East Hampshire and their contributions. And then there is the tenant farmers, Mr Speaker. Around a third of agricultural land is farmed by tenants. Just recently, I was speaking to Tom, a tenant farmer who stands to lose not only his livelihood, but also his family home, as his landlords scramble to reduce their IHT liability before April 26. The Tenant Farmers Association is already warning of the mass renegotiation of many agricultural tenancies ahead of the family farm tax kicking in. So for the tenant farmers, there is no protection because the government didn't see it fit to recognise their unique situation. So will the Minister recognise the injustice tenants like Tom are being exposed to through this government's choices and provide protections for those with tenancies? And for the whole agricultural sector, there has been many points made by members on this side of the House, including my honourable friend for Cheshire and Edelsbury, who has been talking about the wider implications on our food sector. And just last week, I was at the Yorkshire Agricultural Machinery Show, which I attended just last week, and met a tractor dealer, which is also a family business, that are struggling to stay afloat. And why? Because confidence is draining from the farming sector, and they are seeing orders for new tractors and machinery equipment significantly being reduced. And I will give way to the honourable member.
Him for his sterling work. He will know early mornings, late nights, no holidays, low profit margins is a typical day in the life of a British farmer. They do it because they love the land, to feed our nation and to sustain our rural communities. Would he therefore agree with me that this tax grab is a wrecking ball? It will decimate our family farms, and if Labour proceed with it, they will have the death of rural Britain and rural Ulster on their hands. We need to stand up and stop this tax grab and ensure that those farmers that are outside this building today are heard in this place today.
Yeah. And I absolutely thank the honourable member for her intervention and could not agree with her more. And what has been telling in this debate is that we've not only had strong voices and strong representation from Northern Ireland, but indeed Scotland and every part of this United Kingdom, all voicing their concerns that Labour's choice to bring out this family farm tax will have catastrophic consequences, not only on those hard-working family businesses that are right outside the gates of the Houses of Parliament now, but the wider agricultural sector, as indeed those comments that have been made to me at the Yorkshire Agricultural Machinery Show, which I attended earlier this week. Because those machinery dealers are telling me that they are also not only being impacted by the lack of confidence now that is resulting through Labour's choices in reducing inheritance tax relief, but also the consequences of employers' national insurance and other pressures which are being put on the wider sector. And if it wasn't bad enough for this particular business that I spoke to, through their own calculations that they have already made, they will be liable to nearly £800,000 on death tax liability as a result of the changes to business property relief. And in addition, this is a business that has been trading, Mr Chairman, for over 130 years, which are now facing the end of the line. So it is not just those farming family businesses that are being impacted, but the wider agricultural sector. And as has been raised, Mr Chairman, by the honourable member for Gordon and Buchan, research has been undertaken by the NFU, which suggests, quite rightly, unfortunately, that 75% of farming businesses will be affected. Research undertaken and released just recently by Savills is suggesting 88% of farmland will be affected, and research conducted by the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers suggests that the government underestimates this tax impact by fivefold. These are professionals in the industry, and the government has not even willing to listen to the points that they are making, and I will give way.
I'm very, very grateful, and he's speaking very, very powerfully about the issues that are going to affect the farming community. He mentioned the NFU, and particularly the NFU in Scotland, who I met recently. And what I was appalled by is the Treasury have refused to meet them. The representative body of farmers in Scotland reaching out repeatedly for the Treasury and the Treasury officials to meet them so they can discuss their concerns. The Treasury Minister and the team are refusing to engage. They're just not listening. Does he agree with me? That's a complete, they're just not taking the responsibilities or understanding the impact as seriously as they should.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And the point that he makes very powerfully is this, that collectively, all industry bodies, indeed professionals in this sector, are all united in saying exactly the same thing, whether it is the NFU, the CLA, the CAAV, which I put on record that I am a fellow, having previously practised as a rural practice surveyor, understanding the implications on value of farmland. Indeed, Savills, as a key land agent, are all saying exactly the same thing, that this government's policy will have catastrophic consequences. And it is my understanding, Mr Chairman, that the Chancellor has not even bothered, as of yet, to reach out to any of these professional organisations, sit round the table and understand the concerns that are being brought forward, a point that was made very eloquently by my honourable friend, the member for Bridlington and the Wolds, and I will give way.
I'm very grateful to Shannon for giving me articulating the substance of this with great passion. Does he agree with me that at the heart of this fiscal misadventure is classic Treasury dogma, whereby the principal objective is to quantify the price of something and pay no cognizance to the value of it? And APR and BPR will unravel for this government. Does he agree that it would be far better for the government to take steps to roll back on this now, rather than wait for it to absolutely go pear-shaped?
And I thank the honourable member for Angus for the points that he has been making. But he makes a very powerful point, that this is about this government, Labour's choices that they are imposing on many of our family farming businesses, who are now having to make those absolute difficult decisions as to whether they look at disposing of land or potentially plant or machinery or indeed livestock to fit a potential IHT liability that may come down the line, all of which is reducing the productivity of that farming business, all of which will not only impact those family farming businesses, but impact UK food production and UK food security. And that's why I join all of the members on this side of the House in calling on the government to change course immediately, because farmers are not multi-millionaires. Many struggle to break even. Some, as have already been said in this debate by my honourable friend for Beverley and Holderness, indeed my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedsdale, that the vast majority of returns that are experienced from many of our farming businesses is less than 1%. Yet the value of the land that they sit on will, in most cases, be severely impacted as a result of the IHT changes, because the threshold that the government is bringing out is £1 million, when the average size of a farm in England is 200 acres, and you take into account the value of farmland, the cottage that may exist on the farm, the plant or machinery, the livestock, the growing crops or stocks that may be in store, the value will be significantly higher than £1 million, and that is why the government needs to listen to the NFU in their statistics, and I will give way.
Speaking exceptionally well, encapsulates the opinion of almost everybody in this chamber, and I thank him for that. The threshold, and my contribution, I referred to the threshold, should, instead of being 1 million, on a rateable value in the 70s, 80s, 90s and the whole way through, it should be today's value. Therefore, the threshold should not be 1 million, it should be at least 5 million. Does he agree?
Well, what I would say to the honourable member is if the Conservatives had been absolutely clear, we would axe the family farm tax, we would reverse the changes to business property relief and agricultural property relief, which is having such huge catastrophic implications. So actually, the government, in my view, needs to go further, not twinker with thresholds, but provide proper, decent certainty to the whole of the agricultural community by reversing these catastrophic implications that they admit themselves is only going to give a revenue to the Treasury of about £500 million, which, to my understanding, keeps the NHS going for about 20 hours. So for the detrimental impact that this is going to have, the government should think about reversing this disastrous policy to start with. So for the 10th time of asking in this place, What impact assessment has the Treasury done on the effect on growth within our entire agricultural sector as a result of the autumn budget, including all of those other negative implications to do with employers' national insurance, minimum wage increase, delinked payments significantly reducing, the impact of capital grants disappearing, before we even start talking about the family farm tax? So, Dr. Murison, when this tax was first announced at the budget, I thought that maybe, just maybe, our new Labour government were just being naive. Perhaps they didn't understand the catastrophic impact their budget will have on our farming businesses, and they would change course soon after. But after 6 months, the government has consistently refused to listen to the NFU, the CLA, the TFA, the CAAV and members on this side of the House and others who have repeatedly tried to expose the damaging impact of this tax.
Well, Honourable give way.
I will give way.
He's been very, very generous with his time. The one group of people who he's not yet mentioned are the supermarkets. Tesco, Asda, Marks & Spencer's, Lidl, Aldi, Co-op, Sainsbury's and Morrison's have all urged the Labour government to pause and consult, because the UK's future food security is at risk because of this policy.
And I thank my honourable friend for his point, and indeed that is absolutely the point. That is others outside of the sector, including all of our supermarkets, that have come together in agreement in saying how catastrophic the damage will be on this farming sector from this Labour government. Indeed, 250,000 who signed the petition launched by the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, which was presented to the Treasury a month ago, all agree with the comments that we are making on this side of the House. The Labour government have willfully ignored the farming community, the machinery dealers, the feed merchants, the auction marts, the supermarkets, the wider agricultural sector, including accountants, bank managers, land agents, and indeed the wider public, who have all voiced their concerns that the family farm tax would have a crippling impact on UK agriculture. And on top of that, the Chancellor, as I have said, continues to meet with any stakeholders. And as we have seen today, not even a DEFRA minister has had the decency to turn up to this debate, despite it being of incredible importance. So no, they weren't being naive, Mr. Chairman. The reality is much worse. What is clear now is that this government's family farm tax is purposely vindictive. Indeed, I believe now it was designed to be this way. The government's actual intent is to send a strong message out to our farmers that they are not needed, that they do not matter, that they do not play a vital part in our national agenda. Well, Mr. Chair, for someone who has been involved in agriculture all my life since entering this place, this is personal to me. And that's why, on this side of the House, we do value our farmers. And that is why the Conservatives will axe the family farm tax, reverse the changes to agricultural property relief and business property relief. No ifs, no buts. And like I have said, I can only hope that the Minister is about to get to his feet to confirm right now, today, with all of our farming community watching this debate and the many others on the streets of Westminster who have travelled far afield to get here, that his government is going to listen, that his government is going to make changes and hopefully will axe their vindictive family farm tax. And if he doesn't, I can tell him that we on this side of the House will keep coming back again and again until he and his government finally stand up for our farmers up and down this country.
Thank you, Dr. Murison, and it's a pleasure to speak in this debate with you as Chair. And I'd like to begin by extending my thanks, as other members have done, to my honourable friend, the member for South Norfolk, for opening today's debate, and I recognise his commitment to making sure his constituents' opinions are heard here today. I'd also like to thank all other honourable members for contributing to the debate today and setting out their views. I appreciate, Mr. Chair, that some members disagree with either the principle or the detail of what the changes the government has announced to agricultural and business property relief. It is important to be able to debate this issue here today, given the public interest in this topic. I am aware of the strength of feeling both within the room today and outside, including almost 150,000 people who who have signed this petition. I understand, as the petition sets out, there are concerns about the impacts of the reforms to the reliefs, particularly on working farms. And I will seek to address the points that honourable members have raised in just a moment. But first, I would like to emphasise the fact that the decision to reform agricultural property relief and business property relief was not taken lightly. It was one of many tough decisions that we had to take at the autumn budget in 2024, given the incredibly challenging fiscal position we inherited from the previous administration.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I appreciate my honourable friend giving way. Does he agree with me that until we improve the living standards of ordinary working people, we will never drive up the profitability or sustainability of family farms? And it's the party opposite, with their budget choices, that devastated our rural communities, and only a Labour government will focus on improving living standards for every single person living in my constituency of North Warwickshire and Bedworth.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she's absolutely right about the importance of having repaired the public finances, supporting public services for her constituents in North Warwickshire and Bedworth, and indeed for all of our constituents across the country. And I noted in her contribution earlier, she made a point around the profitability of the farming sector and what this government is doing to support that. And she may have seen that at the Oxford Farming Conference in January, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs set out the government's long-term vision, including reforms to use the government's own purchasing power to make sure we're buying more British food, planning reforms to speed up the delivery of infrastructure, and indeed work to ensure supply chain fairness, which will help both constituents of hers involved in the farming industry and those more widely across her constituency and others here today. So I thank my honourable friend for her intervention today. As I was saying, Mr. Chair, the decision that we took around agricultural property relief and business property relief to reform these reliefs was one of the difficult but necessary decisions that we took on tax, welfare and spending that we needed to take to restore economic stability, to fix the public finances and to support public services, including an NHS in crisis. We have taken those decisions in a way that makes the tax system fairer and more sustainable. The reforms to agricultural property relief and business property relief mean that despite the tough fiscal context, the government will still maintain very significant levels of relief from inheritance tax beyond what is available to others. The government recognises the role that these reliefs play, particularly in supporting small farms and businesses, and under our reforms, they will continue to play that role. Now, Mr. Chair, the case for reform is underlined by the fact that full, unlimited exemption introduced in 1992 has become unsustainable. Under the current system, the benefit of the 100% relief on business and agricultural assets is heavily skewed towards the wealthiest estates. According to the latest data from HMRC, and as other members in this debate have also mentioned, 40% of agricultural property relief benefits the top 7% of estates making claims. That's 117 estates claiming £219 million worth of relief. It is a similar... I'll give way.
Giving way. On the point he's just said about the notional value of estates, I think I can help him, because that's where he's going wrong. That's where he's taken his government up an agricultural cul-de-sac. It is not the notional value of the estate when it comes to agriculture. It is how you came by that estate, and whether you used millions or billions of pounds of money you should have been paying tax on to not pay tax, or whether you inherited the family farm from the generation that went before you. That is the differentiation that the Treasury should be making. The value is irrelevant. It's the nature of the inheritance or the acquisition that the Minister should be focusing on.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his contribution, but what has driven the government in making the decision to reform agricultural and business property relief is the overwhelming priority of fixing the public finances, whilst doing so in a way that is fair and sustainable. And that is why, looking at the statistics I was just referring to in terms of how agricultural and business property relief have come to be used in recent years, is important for understanding the context in which we decided the need for reform was now, because I will just respond fully to the honourable gentleman's point, because as I was saying before he intervened, the data from HMRC, which other members have also referred to in this debate, shows that 40% of agricultural property relief benefits the top 7% of estates. And it's a similar picture for business property relief, where more than 50% of business property relief is claimed by just 4% of estates making claims, which equates to 158 estates claiming £558 million in tax relief. And I would say to the honourable gentleman that given the wider pressures on the public finances, we do not believe this is fair or sustainable, and we felt it was appropriate to reform how these reliefs operate. Yes.
I'm extremely grateful to the Minister. Just to follow up my question, which I channeled his direction earlier, could he say something about the average profitability of family farms, because that does put this in context?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. And earlier in the debate, we heard about the return on capital, which I think was raised, and we heard that the average return on capital is 0.5%. But I'm sure he will also be aware that 10% of farms in England have made a return on capital of 10%. So it is a more complicated picture than the one perhaps presented earlier in the debate. And similarly, farm business income, which is net profit, shows a wide variation on profitability. But in the design of the reforms that we have announced, we've obviously considered the way in which those who have assets which currently claim agricultural property relief or business property relief need to still have generous relief, which is inherent in the design of the reforms that we're proposing, where there is full 100% relief for the first £1 million of assets, above other nil rate bands, the spousal transfers and so on, and then effectively an unlimited 50% relief thereafter. And one more time.
Really appreciate it, and I thank the Minister for his answer and giving us that variation, which I'm sure is there. It's try to come out with the average or the median, just to give us a sense of what the vast bulk, rather than just the top 10%. What does the average look like? What does the median look like? What's the reality for most farms up and down this country?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his further intervention, but I suppose the important point for me in understanding how these reliefs are reformed is to focus our conclusions on the data of claims, because the data which matters in terms of understanding how many estates are likely to be affected by the changes relates to the data on claims. And that's why the information that I was setting out around where the bulk of the relief currently goes is based on claims data. And in a moment, I'll come to some other statistics which were referred to in the debate. I'm going to make a little progress, and I will take interventions in a second, but let me make a little progress on this, because the data which I just referred to around where the relief currently goes, and indeed I was going to address in a moment the data around the number of estates making claims that we think will be affected in 26-27, is based on actual claims data, which we believe is the right data on which to base. I'm going to make some progress. But I will take interventions in a moment. But let me just make a little progress here. Based on the statistics I've just set out around where the vast majority or the bulk of the benefit from agricultural property relief and business property relief have been going, we felt it was appropriate to reform how these reliefs operate, and that's why the government decided to change how we target agricultural property relief and business property relief from April 2026. And as I've said already, Mr. Chair, we're doing so in a way that maintains significant tax relief for all estates, including for small farms and businesses, whilst making sure we repair the public finances. Under the reforms that we have announced, all individuals will of course be able to access the general nil rate bands and spousal exemptions that apply within the inheritance tax system. On top of those allowances, any business and agricultural property within people's estates will benefit from 100% relief on a further £1 million of combined assets, except in cases of shares designated as not listed on the markets of recognised stock exchanges. And beyond the £1 million of full relief, a further 50% relief would apply with no limit. This means that any inheritance tax that is paid will be paid at a reduced effective rate of up to 20% rather than the standard 40%. The reliefs in the reform system... Yes.
Does the Minister not understand that by penalising the family farm and at the same time offering the 20% threshold, he actually still leaves a situation where purchasing land is still a very attractive option for those who wish to shelter their wealth by buying land. He penalises those he wants to protect while protecting those he seeks to penalise.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his intervention, but if we consider those who will still have generous protection from inheritance tax under the reform system which we've announced, I would point him toward the fact that, Mr. Chair, the release in the reform system will mean that when taken together with the spousal exemptions and the nil rate bans, up to £3 million, depending on people's individual circumstances, can be passed on by a couple to their children or grandchildren free of any inheritance tax. I'll give way.
There's been much debate this afternoon about the discrepancies between the various estimates. On the one side, the Treasury's estimates of some 500 farms affected every year, and those from the NFU, FUW, CAV, AHDB, I can name a few. Is he not concerned, and should it not give the government pause for thought, that the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers has estimated that just in Wales alone, their proposals will bring in an extra 200 family farms subject to an inheritance tax liability? Now, that would constitute some 40% of the UK total, if we are to believe the government's estimates.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I was just about to come to some of the statistics which he referred to and which others have referred to today, and I'm conscious I haven't got that much time, so I will make a little progress to answer some of these questions now. But may I just finally say on the point around how the nil rate ban, spousal exemption and allowances work together, which is that anything beyond the nil rate bans, spousal transfers and the 100% full relief will receive unlimited 50% relief, and heirs can spread any payments that are due over 10 years interest-free, which is a benefit that is not seen anywhere else in the inheritance tax system. Mr. Chair, I'm going to make some progress if honourable members will allow me to do so. Now, Mr. Chair, I want to turn to the impact these reforms will have on taxpayers, because I know there's been a lot of discussion over the impacts of the policy and the numbers which various honourable members have raised during this debate. Now, as has been set out by the government in recent months, up to 520 estates in 26-27 claiming agricultural property relief, including those that also claim business property relief, are expected to pay more as a result of this change. This means that around 3/4 of estates claiming agricultural property relief, including those that also claim business property relief, will not pay any more tax as a result of these changes. Now, I'm going to make some progress. Now, the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats asked about how these figures are arrived at. The figure of 520 that I referred to takes the historic data and projects it forward using economic determinants. Now, the letter that you may have seen from the Chancellor to the Treasury Select Committee in November sets out how that calculation is done. And I would suggest that all members read that letter from the Chancellor to understand the basis for that number of 520 estates which are likely to be affected in 26-27. The statistics also show how many estates are likely to be affected who are claiming business property relief, because the statistics show that around 3/4 of estates claiming business property relief alone, excluding those only holding AIM shares, will not pay any more inheritance tax in 26-27 either. And the Office of Budget Responsibility has been clear. They do not expect this measure to have any significant macroeconomic impacts. Now, Mr. Chair, I recognise the disagreement over this policy, but ministers and officials have been listening carefully to the views of the farming sector and rural communities. Ahead of the budget, there was media speculation that the government was going to abolish the reliefs altogether. In reaction to that speculation, the Treasury received and considered several representations from the farming sector with their views on retaining the reliefs, and I responded to a debate on this matter in this very room on October the 17th. I've only got a few minutes left. No. I've also participated in several meetings with farming bodies since autumn budget 2024, and I am meeting farming bodies again shortly to discuss their concerns further. At the same time, it is important to recognise that other organisations have called for these reliefs to be abolished or restricted. Commentators have highlighted that these reliefs currently contribute to an inheritance tax system that means the very largest estates pay lower effective tax rates than the smaller estates. As the Institute for Fiscal Studies has set out since the budget, the changes we have announced will still leave farmland much more lightly taxed than other assets. And Mr Chair, I will move quickly to make sure I can address as many of the points that my honourable friends and honourable members have raised during this debate as possible. But I think it is worth saying, Mr Chair, that as several honourable members have raised in their contributions today, it is important to see these changes in the context of wider support for farmers and the rural community. The budget committed £5 billion to farming over the next 2 years, including the biggest budget for sustainable food production in our history. It committed £60 million to help farmers affected by unprecedented wet weather last year, and we are protecting farms and rural businesses by committing £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to rebuild crumbling flood defences. We will also continue to provide existing support for the farming industry in the wider tax system. This includes, for example, the exemption from business rates for agricultural land and buildings, and the ongoing entitlement for vehicles and machinery used in agriculture to use red diesel, as the Honourable Member for Dumfries and Galloway mentioned. Now, briefly to respond to a point made by the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland around the inheritance tax treatment of Scottish agricultural leases, which he referred to in his comments. The Government is aware of this issue, and officials have already discussed it with their counterparts in the Scottish Government. There is already an existing provision in the Inheritance Tax Act that deals explicitly with these Scottish agricultural leases. Section 177 of the Inheritance Tax Act means Scottish agricultural leases passed down on death are not included in the value of the estate. I've only got a few moments. My honourable friend, the member for Northumberland, asked about introducing a working farmer test. I would draw my honourable friend's attention to the fact that a test where relief was only provided if, amongst other things, the individual received 75% of their income from agriculture. It did exist in the UK for a short period, between 1975 and 1981. However, it was removed because of concerns about the impact it was having on the availability of land for tenant farming. And finally, Mr Chair, I would like to address an issue which was raised by a number of members, including the member for North Cornwall and Chester South and Edinburgh, around mental health amongst farming community. The Government is committed to supporting farmers and agricultural workers in accessing the support they need to protect their mental health. And DEFRA already works with a range of farming charities, including the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institution and the Yellow Wellies charity, which the Liberal Democrat spokesperson mentioned, and these have highlighted the mental health challenges for farming communities more generally. To conclude, Dr Murison, as we've heard today, the reforms to inheritance tax generate strong views, and I understand that. I recognise that a small number of estates will have to pay more tax, but the reform of these reliefs is necessary given the fiscal challenge which confronts us and the fact that the bulk of the cost of the reliefs have become skewed towards the wealthiest estates. We must put our public finances back on a stable footing and repair our broken public services. We are doing so in a way that involves tough decisions, but that is as fair as possible and that preserves significant relief from inheritance tax for small farms and businesses. Thank you again, Dr Murison, and I thank all honourable members who have spoken today.
Wind up. A point of order, Julie Buchan.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and thank you for allowing my point of order. The manner in which the Shadow Minister described the view that a farmer was better off if he committed suicide before April 26 was highly irresponsible. This is a public debate on a very emotive subject. It is televised and it is being shared across social media in real time. This is not the moment to encourage anyone to consider suicide. Farmers' anxiety and mental health is running high, and this is the moment to engage constructively with the Treasury and farmers and the NFU, who have been in dialogue, to seek the transition to taper support that I referred to in my own intervention, to avoid the very scenario that you repeated. Every member here cares for our farmers. It's the reason that has brought us all from different parties together to discuss this matter in a respectful manner. In the interest, Mr Chairman, if I may finish, in the interest of mature and responsible debate, will the honourable member kindly correct the record that he does not condone suicide but encourages constructive dialogue.
To the Honourable Lady for giving me notice of her point of order. She probably knows it isn't a point of order, but her remarks are now on the record. Point of order, Shadow Minister.
In my contribution to this House, I was making very clear live and real conversations, concerns, queries, frustrations that were being brought forward not only to me in my position of holding the shadow farming role, but also to other members on this side of the House, indeed to other organisations that sit outside of this House, namely those in a position of representing the farming community. These are real live issues and representations that are being brought to us, and therefore I do think it is just and right, Dr Murison, to be using my role as the Shadow Farming Minister to bring before this House, in front of the Government Minister, those very live concerns and real conversations that are happening around many a family farm home just now. So I thank you for allowing the point of order.
Will know that's not a point of order either, but his remarks are on the record. Ben Goldriff.
Thank you very much, Dr Murison. As the time is short on this, and as a tradition, we'd normally notify everyone and say thank you to every individual, but there is not enough time for that. I would like to say so much for the wide engagement across all political parties within this Parliament. I would like to thank everyone for being able to try and take this debate in a better sense going forward, of honesty and openness and transparency and everything. I would also like to thank colleagues in the NFU as well, who today hosted an event within Parliament, and I know that they've been sat patiently at the back of this chamber, but also outside, listening to the words that we say, because the words that we say in this chamber carry a huge amount of weight. And I know that going forward, that these conversations will continue in the back rooms and in the corridors to make sure that our farmers' voices are heard, and that we don't use events like this for grandstanding. And as much as my style may be counted as vanilla by the Honourable Member for Beverley and Holderness, the one thing I would say to him in jest is vanilla's a favourite flavour of ice cream in the United Kingdom. So I'll take that as a win. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 700138 relating to inheritance tax relief for working farms. As many are as of that opinion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No! My opinion as to which side is in the majority has been challenged. Under paragraph 13 of Standing Order 10, the question is therefore not decided, and that shall be reported to the House. It is possible for the question subsequently to be put to the House for decision without further debate. Order, order.